Hey guys. This is part 9 of What If Naruto Was Raised by the Third Raikage. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 30, Endgame. The thief gang as well as Yujito and En huddled around the table for the last time. Spread out were blueprints and all of the information they had gotten from Haimai, neatly organized by Bentor. It's time. Tsurai announced at the head of the table of what En had deemed the War Council table. It's time to get rid of Chifu, once and for all. At the last word, Tsurai banged his fist against the table with a resulting crash, and slurped up the noodles that were on his chopsticks, using one of said chopsticks to point at the blueprint of a certain building. That's where he's going to be at, but how do we sneak in and get him out of the open? It's a civilian building and any fighting in there will cause unwanted casualties. Simple, Bentor said as he used a napkin to rub off any dirt on his glasses. We use bait. At this, everyone's heads turned towards Yujito, who scowled and crossed her arms in frustration. No, Yujito said through gritted teeth, her blue eyes flashing amber dangerously. No way in the 7 hells will I do something so perverse. She spluttered out. Kunoichi or not, she still had some pride. Not to mention she was 12, and to think people in that building wouldn't care was disturbing to say the least. Come on, Yujito-chan, take one from the team. It's not like this job is your lifelong dream. And said as he leaned backwards in his chair, his arms crossed behind his head as a makeshift pillow. Yujito stood up, grabbed a stray roll of sushi and pelted it at En's face, hitting it dead on. En jerked backwards and fell flat on his back on the ground. Ah wow. A low moan from under the table came from the downed Kyuubi Jinchuuriki. I would rather take the Shusher missions for the rest of my life than do that, Yujito growled out, glaring at the 3 men who were still left sitting, and grabbed the edge of the table and hauled himself up, pieces of rice plastered on his face, and a stray piece of spicy tuna straying dangerously close to his left nostril. Is it really that bad to go undercover there? Yujito pointed her finger accusingly at the blueprint of the only building in the town that Chifu went to. It's a geisha house, she exclaimed, her nose curled in disgust and her eyes burning with a certain fire that dared any of the teens to say something at the risk of being barbecued by the Nibi Jinchuuriki. En's face scrunched up before turning towards Bentor. Remind me again. What is a geisha? He asked, where the thieves' sweat dropped at En's innocence. Tsurai started to say, not knowing how much he should tell him. He was 12 and probably didn't have much of a clue. Maybe he should be subtle. A geisha is a female entertainer. Nailed it, Tsurai mentally cheered, and perked at that. Oh, so she sings? He looked at Yujito, who had a sweat drop of her own. You could do that. I'll give you some of those lessons me and B have been meaning to give you. Then again, Tsurai thought with a roll of his eyes. This is En. Maybe I should give him some Ika books, early birthday present. Not that type of entertainer, En blinked, not sure of how to continue without being punched in the face. He instead opted to back up and attempt to blend into the drab walls, which failed as the pure white Chunin flak jacket made him stand out in the dark background. Bentor had remained calm during the outburst. He instead munched on some rice while he patiently waited for the angry female to calm down. Yujito, you are the only girl here, so you have to be the one to lure him out of the building. Chifu may be an apparent perv, but I don't think he finds a 12-year-old girl sexy, Yujito said before turning green, unless he's more sick than we realized. To their surprise, it was Mari who talked next. The reason they were surprised was because Mari didn't really pay much attention to the boring details of a planned heist or attack. He was more of a berserker who went in and destroyed everything in his path with his muscles. Much like the Yatsuki clan, in fact. Mari mostly spent these meetings eating, napping, snacking, lounging, reading comic books, or playing with his action figures. I don't think that Yujito should go, he said while the others looked at him. Yujito sent him a nod of gratitude. Pervert or not, even if he was drunk, it would be impossible to hide the fact that Yujito is a ninja. The way she moves is a dead giveaway. While a geisha is supposed to move gracefully, there is a difference when you're a shinobi and need to be graceful. It would just be a red flag and we'd be surrounded by guards before we could say oopsie daisies, he finished grimly, his deep voice seeming to vibrate in the small room. Tsurai and Bentor glanced at one another. Some sort of unsaid conversation seemed to take place between the genius and the thief. We can worry about who's going to lure him out later. Right now let's just focus on Chifu's strengths and weaknesses. Well, for one, isn't he a summoner? And asked as that had been indeed a good piece of information they had gotten out of Haimai. The problem was that Haimai didn't know what animal he could summon, seeing as he had never seen the contract itself, but he was certain 100% that he did indeed have a summoning contract. Bentor nodded his head. Shame we don't know what animal he has. Obviously it is either a stolen contract or a contract so unknown nobody would guess it. I guess we'll find out one way or another. So he is a great strategist, has a bunch of katan and right-on jutsu under his belt, and is decent at taijutsu. Yujito listed off the strengths while keeping count with one finger. That leaves his weakness to be wind if he uses right-on, but will end badly if it hits a katan jutsu. Water is useful unless it hits lighting, which makes it into a conduit, something we don't want. The only good thing is N and I's taijutsu, Mari's strength, Bentor's brain, and Surai's agility and kenjutsu. I personally think we're a pretty badass team, one that bad guys could only have in a dream, and added in helpfully. Not to mention us using our Biju's chakra if needed, and thought though he knew that was a last resort, no need for his dad or any enemies to learn of a Jinchuuriki with control over some of his tenants' chakra, specifically that they appeared to be the Nibi and Kyuubi Jinchuuriki, and would rather live past the tender age of 12, thank you very much. N and Yujito were wearing dark gray cloaks that hid all of their weapons and their flak jackets from the view of civilians. They were currently heading towards the geisha house where Chifu would no doubt be. The guards paid them no mind, either because they didn't deem the people who had the height and stature of a young teenager to be threatening, or they just didn't realize that since N and Yujito had stashed their cloud hiatate in their pockets, there was no way anyone would know that they were trained killers from the greatest of the elemental nations. You guys in? Bentor asked the two Chunin via radio transmitter. Yujito subtly placed her hand on her ear. Yeah, we're in. Yujito's face scrunched up when she realized how many of Chifu's thugs were here huddled around the stage. Can we burn this place to the ground? The young girl asked. No, I think that would alert people of our plans. Yujito scowled. Whatever, and nudged her with his elbow. Come on, Yujito-chan. We gotta wait for the signal. Until then let's stick to the shadows and look for our pervy foe. And said in his normal rhymes, a small smirk on his lips while Yujito rolled her eyes at his antics. The two young chunin walked to the side of the large room, their forms almost completely hidden by the dark shadows. Their eyes, however, remained wide open as they searched for the tyrant they had been working for over a month to bring down. It was Yujito who saw him first. There he is, she whispered to her comrade, who immediately followed her gaze and saw for the first time the man capable of taking over whole countries and their governments without any help. Like the photo Raisin had showed them, Chifu Tora stood out among the crowd of guards. He was easily the tallest man there, with lean muscles that showed that despite not having much in bulk, he could probably destroy you with sheer speed. His tan skin was almost golden in color, something that stood out amongst the red-skinned guards and their steel armor. He was currently sitting in a chair, smoking a cigar as he watched the stage. Code purple, or was it blue? And muttered into the radio transmitter. Anyway, we found old Chifu. So get in here, you fool. Roger that in, and for the love of God it was code gray. Honestly, why do I even bother with my presentations if you don't even pay attention? Bentor muttered to himself, obviously upset that his great artistic and creative mind was stuck with making presentations to people who didn't even listen. Close enough. Now how exactly were you planning on getting Chifu out of here? The place is packed with these dumb guards. They'd be more than willing to put up a fight if we try and grab him. Not that they could stand up to our might. And rapped to the young genius. Mari, you're on. Bentor said into the radio, making the two young chunin confused. What did he mean? All right. Mari's unmistakable voice rang into the headsets. Time to show these guys. To fear the Mari. All of a sudden the stage went dark. The other performers had left to go backstage, leaving the stage abandoned. Suddenly fog started to swirl in via a fog machine, lights started to flash, and a figure appeared on the stage. Thanks to the lights coming from the back of the stage, no one could see the front of the figure due to the shadows hiding everything, and then a spotlight beamed down on the figure. And Yujito's jaws dropped to the ground in disbelief on who was on stage. It was Mari, who was currently decked in a light green kimono and a light blue belt that was highly feminine. His normally red face was hidden under a layer of white kabuki makeup, complete with lipstick. His hair, which was normally hidden under his cap, was revealed to be black and had been styled into an ornate bun with two pins sticking out from the bun. He had two fans in his hands. They were pure white with red kanji on them. Yujito's hand immediately covered En's eyes from the awful sight, all the while wishing she had bleach to burn her eyes with. Sadly, she doubted that would help. Like those two bushy-eyed-browed clones in Konoha, the image seemed to have burned within her memory. Mari blinked shyly at the guards and the other people in the geisha house, obviously trying to act coyly to keep up his act. He fanned his painted face lightly with the fan in his right hand. He then slowly raised his hands and curtsied to the people. Konnichiwa. Mari greeted the seated men. I am the most famous Madame Geisha. Please allow me to entertain you, he said. His normally deep and husky voice sounded much more lighter, as the hulky man tried to sound like a woman, though there was still a couple traces of the huskiness hidden in his tone. Oh my god, Yujito whispered in disbelief, and was currently looking at the stage as a dazed gaze. He too looked unable to believe what was actually happening. Yujito-chan. Are we in hell? And suddenly asked as he looked at his comrade. I'm pretty sure we're in hell, but I can't really tell. Before the young girl could answer, the entire situation got worse. Music started to blast from the surrounding stereos, a peppy upbeat song that sounded rather different from the various songs and music the two had heard. Normally N would have been interested to hear a new type of music, but at this very moment N wished that he was blind, deaf, and completely numb to the outside world. He was feeling rather numb, but he decided that was from the shock and complete horror. And then it got even worse, something no one would have thought possible. Mari started to dance. Using his fans, Mari started to dance to the beat of the song that was playing. Waving his rather large body around like a professional dancer seemed completely wrong to those who knew him, which was of course N and Yujito. But none of the guards or even Chifu himself seemed to notice that the famous Madame Geisha was not in fact a real geisha or even a woman, but a large bulky man capable of barreling through iron walls wearing a rather tight-looking dress. What was even worse was that the guards were actually hooting the supposed geisha on, cat calls and wolf whistles following as Mari continued to dance to the beat. Behind him on stage, pink fountain fireworks were being lit. The bright pink lights seemed to only encourage Mari on. A couple of the guards started tossing roses and flowers of various types and shades onto the stage, including several types of coins from various nations. Why a bunch of guards dressed in a random assortment of armor they either stole from a shop or from a corpse had flowers on their person when they went to a geisha house was lost to any onlooker. And Yujito watched with continuing horror as the thugs continued to hoot and howl. Mari just kept on dancing, and then suddenly turned to Yujito, who was very desperate to tear her burning eyes off the stage. For some reason, and I don't know why, and said loudly over the music and the hollers of the thugs, I feel like my entire childhood has been defiled right before my eyes. But somehow I was suspecting this to happen. You mean you expected Bentor's master plan was to dress Mari as a female entertainer, strap him in a tight dress, put kabuki makeup on him, teach him on how to dance like a geisha, all to lead Chifu out of this place? Yujito asked in disbelief. How the hell did you suspect something like this? And why didn't you warn me about this? This whole thing has probably scarred me for life. Well, I was hoping my gut was wrong for once in my life. Trust me, this doesn't exactly sit with me right, and retorted. Yujito resisted the urge to whack her fellow Jinchuuriki upside the head. This isn't a time to be rapping, and there's always a time for rap. Honestly, how long have you known me and be kitty cat? Stop calling me that, and didn't reply. He instead resisted the urge to gag as he watched one of the thugs looking at Mari with a dazed, lovesick gaze, his tongue lagging as he leaned his cheek against his meaty and beefy palm. It wasn't long until Mari somehow managed to lure Chifu out of the building, still under the guise of a woman. Oh Chifu, there's something I need to tell you, Mari said in that rather revolting feminine voice. Chifu raised a single brow. What do you mean, geisha? He asked with narrowed eyes, his cold black eyes seemingly burned into the so-called female entertainer. I mean, Mari's voice was still high and somewhat squeaky, and then all of a sudden Mari with as much manly gusto ripped off the tight teal dress to reveal his normal attire of brown pants and his way too tight blue t-shirt. I'm a man! Mari yelled out, his hands placed against his hips as he proudly looked on, his brown eyes burning with fire. Chifu turned green and backed away. Eh? He asked with a curl to his lips. You're a man? He asked with wide eyes, inwardly wondering how he had missed that small piece of vital information. Mari beamed at the criminal. The Mari is a master of disguises. Don't be offended, puny criminal, for the Mari has always been known for his quick wit. Mari's flushed face tilted slightly, a smirk on his lips as he ominously cracked his knuckles. Now the Mari will crush you. Chifu bit down on his lit cigar, his smirk turning smug as he looked at the rather boisterous thief. Just you? He asked calmly as he took a large inhale of the cigar before taking it out, and blowing a ring of smoke into Mari's face. The large man coughed and hacked at the fumes. This is the best the Kupa clan can offer? A man playing dress-up? Before Mari could respond, several shadows appeared on the outskirts of the clearing. An audible cough was easily distinguished, and everyone turned to see Surai Kupa leaning against the aged bark. A wicked long cane made of hardened oak and golden iron was strapped to his back. Hello, meathead. Surai greeted the master criminal with the tip of his navy blue cap. Chifu grinned at the sight of the second to last of the once prestigious line of master thieves, Surai Kupa. What an honor this is, I get to kill you myself. He sneered, his eyes burning with dark excitement at a chance to kill the man who had been such a thorn to his side. Chifu Tora. You really shouldn't have messed with my clan. Surai's gloved hand trailed towards the aged wood of his cane, which was easily the same height as himself. With the air of experience, the thief prodigy hefted the heavy cane onto his shoulder. The golden metal glinted eerily against the soft moonlight. Clan? Chifu Maid looked around him with great exaggeration. I thought you and that fool Ryochi were the last of you annoying Kupas. After all, Chifu's smirk turned into a sneer. They were all murdered, weren't they? Surai's eyes turned murderous. Oh, he drawled out as his fingers wrapped around the familiar wood of his clan's choice of weaponry. You are just asking to get your ass kicked. Chifu smirked. Smugness seemed to ooze off of him like a well-pampered Uchiha. His hand trailed his shoulder and to the hilt of his swords. The end of the cigar burned bright orange as he inhaled. Well then, shall we? Mari, Surai called over to the bulky man. Come on over, you're going to miss this. Mari grinned. Oh yeah. Fight time. He crowed as he strode towards his allies before facing Chifu again, side by side with his friends. There was only silence as the two sides waited for the other to make the first move. The only sounds was the harsh wind and the burning cigar clamped in Chifu's mouth. En and Yujito stood side by side, their matching blue eyes stuck on Chifu's coal black. The cigar turned orange before fading out. Chifu's brows narrowed, his fingers fiddling with the worn hilts of his twin swords. Chifu suddenly whipped out his twin swords. With stunning momentum and speed he swinged the deadly blades in the direction of the assorted thieves and Chunin shinobi. Katan, Gun Suisei, fire style, roaring comets. Dozens of balls made of burning orange fire appeared and streamed towards the Chunin and thieves with deadly accuracy. Surai quickly formed several hand seals as the burning balls of fire got closer and closer. Suetun, Sukin Hiki, water style, water encampment wall. He spat out water that quickly formed a strong wall of durable liquid around the thieves and Chunin. The comets rammed into the water. The wall shivered as it absorbed the impact while the water hissed and became steam as the fiery comets fizzed out against the strong defensive jutsu. Surai suddenly nodded to En, signifying that a signal had been given. The swirling water around them lost its shape and instead rushed towards Chifu, who crouched as though ready to leap into the air. Raitun, electromagnetic murder! And slammed the palms of his hands onto the dry ground. Immediately crimson bolts of electricity sprang from his fingertips and surged through the ground before meeting with the rushing water. Immediately the bolts of electricity turned even more deadly as the water acted as a conduit for the crimson lightning that belonged to En. Chifu jumped up high in the air, before landing on a convenient lamp post. As the water rushed towards the man, he leapt again as the water tore through the wooden post as easily as paper. Yujito rushed towards the criminal, her tanto held at the ready. Clash! One of Chifu's swords struck Yujito's own. They wavered there as the two enemies tried to overpower the other. Their eyes narrowing at each other, Chifu smirked. He spat out his cigar directly at Yujito's face, who instinctively backed away as she saw the smoldering cinders coming near her. He then raised his foot in preparation to kick her across the clearing, but a hand grabbed his leg and stopped him mid-kick. Mari held the man's leg back with a single large and buff hand, a toothy grin plastered on his red cheeks that made him look a bit on the dumber side but still intimidating him. Nobody hurts a friend of the Mari, he roared as he lifted his gloved fist high into the air. Everyone's, including Chifu, eyes widened when his clenched fist suddenly caught a flame but didn't burn through the red glove but instead rested on the man's knuckles. Katan fire fists! Mari cried out as he dealt a devastating punch to the man's torso, sending Chifu flying backwards and through several small abandoned homes before becoming stuck halfway through a stone wall. He then, almost comically, slowly peeled off of the wall and landed to the ground with a small thud, smoke billowing around him from either charred skin or burnt clothing. Before anyone could comment on both Mari's brute strength or his surprisingly good control over fire chakra, with Yujito wondering if the large bodybuilder would give her some tips, Chifu groaned and slowly stood back up. Pieces of dirt slowly fell to the ground. The master criminal's whole torso was covered in a protective layer of dirt, reminding Yujito and En of their fellow Jinchuuriki, Gaara, and his sand shield, albeit weaker and more common. Must be some sort of dirt shield, and realized before giving a smirk so sly anyone would have thought him to be a fox. Good thing that lightning trumps earth every time, oh yeah, and then dashed forward, one of his 7 swords already held ready in his palm, The young Jinchuuriki then channeled a good amount of chakra to his legs before springing up high in the air. Chifu's eyes narrowed as he watched the oncoming attacker and briefly wondered what he was about to do. A jutsu perhaps? Wish. Chifu quickly dodged a deadly sharp sword from impaling right in where his heart would have been. The sword landed in the caked in dirt, and Chifu noticed the faint flickering of crimson sparks running down the light metal. Chifu then jumped backwards as he heard another projectile coming towards him. Another sword landed on the ground slightly to his right. By then En had landed on the ground with 2 swords missing. En spared a quick glance at his best friend and comrades and held up a fist to signify one thing. Don't interfere, have no fear, for En is here to kick some criminal rear. En crowed out, and, not able to stop himself because it was En, did a quick dance complete with his stupid hand gestures that he and B were so fond of using. Surai's amber eyes narrowed at the prospect of En fighting Chifu, who was no lightweight, alone. He was about to step forward when Yujito placed a hand on his shoulder, amber gold meeting blazing blue. Yujito shook her head. Don't let him do this. She then gave the master thief and one of the last of the Kupa clan a grin that reminded Surai of a Cheshire cat. And we'll leave the last blow for you, don't worry. He just wants to get some hits in, then we go in and take him out. Surai reluctantly nodded his head, knowing that En would sooner or later let them join in the fray. From what he could tell from the boy, he was courageous and brave if a bit on the odd side with his weird rhymes. En had retrieved the 2 swords that he had thrown at Chifu and placed them back in his sheaths. Chifu held his 2 Dao swords at the ready. From the twitching scowl on his tanned features, Chifu obviously wanted to chop En into little pieces and stomp on them. Don't worry, get rid of that frown, for I'm here to pound you into the ground. En couldn't help but rap again before his smirk completely disappeared as he reached for his swords. The light reflected off of the twirling metal. Chifu and the thieves watched in surprise as the 7 twirling swords landed on various parts of the body, but none didn't reach the hand. All right. En's muffled voice came from behind the sword he was currently holding in his mouth, and was in the stance that made up the 7 swords dance. Chifu's eyes narrowed before he rushed forward, and stood there on one foot as he patiently waited for the moment to strike. There was the sound of metal clashing with one another. The sword held by the middle of the arm clashed against Chifu's 2 Dao. Both warriors were gritting their teeth as they fought to overcome the other. En's foot that was off of the ground suddenly rose and lashed out. The blade held by the bent knee managed to slice through Chifu's leg. The criminal yelped at the sudden pain and back up, giving En the chance. En suddenly leapt into the air and curled into as close to a ball as possible without stabbing himself with his own sword. He spun so fast he was just a white blur, but quickly his form turned red as lighting sprang from his body and surrounded En in a protective cocoon of deadly chakra. Chifu jerked back as a sword suddenly shot into the ground where his foot had been. Narrowly missing the important appendage, he skirted backwards as more swords joining. Before he could do anything to defend himself, En suddenly appeared from behind him with a raised fist. The clenched fist struck Chifu right in the back, and with the strength of someone who had worked day and night under the grueling Yatsuki physical regime, sent Chifu flying and flailing through the air until the war criminal crashed into a large tree that immediately turned into nothing but shattered splinters and continued to fly forward through the dense underbrush before colliding with the ground. A large crater formed as Chifu saw stars flashing in his vision. Chifu growled and shook his head as though to clear the dizziness. The punch may have been incredibly strong for a boy so young, but Chifu was a hardened criminal and not some greenhorned genin out of the village for the first time. He grabbed his favorite Dao swords, which had fallen to the ground during his tumble through the small collection of trees and dense underbrush, and raced towards En, who had started a backflip that ended up in 2 others, each time using his agile and nimble body to pick up every discarded sword without needing the use of his hands. The 2 swordsmen clashed. The only signs of them were sparks flying as they each jumped back and forth in an intricate dance that few would have been able to follow, though En was lacking both of his feet on the ground and had to stand on one leg. He had been using this form of sword fighting for years and had practiced with B nearly every day after their normal routine that would have killed a normal man unless you were 2 certain green spandex wearing clones from the land of fire, of course. Chifu dodged another well-aimed jab of En's elbow. The sharp metal missed his neck but managed to cut off a bit of his well-done mustache, which of course made Chifu mad, and he attacked with even more fervor. Oh, En thought as he suddenly leaned back so far that his shaggy blonde locks were touching the ground while he tried not to fall flat on his back as he managed to dodge the Dao sword that had expressed the desire to suddenly cut his head off. As the sword swung over him, the foot that wasn't on the ground and still holding on to one of En's special swords suddenly kicked up and hit Chifu right in the hand, making the man instinctively release his grip on one of his Dao. sending the curved sword high into the air thanks to En's rather powerful kick, as did En's sword that had been thrown up into the air when he had kicked up. En used his hands to push himself up and did a quick backflip over the taller man before rolling on the ground as he dodged Chifu's foot that tried to stomp on his head, and quickly got back on his 2 feet. Both swordsmen suddenly paused, before each snatched out into the air, and both men grabbed their missing sword that had been thrown up just a couple moments prior as gravity finally caught up to the deadly weapons. The second En's sword was in his hand. He suddenly released it and let it roll down his arm and bounce off of his flak jacket before being caught by his knee. All of this done in a second, showing that En must have spent hours trying to perfect such a simple yet useful move. Chifu suddenly kicked up and a cloud of dust and dirt rose from the movement. En didn't need to blink away the floating debris since his crimson sunglasses protected his eyesight and was one of the reason he wore them, the other being that they looked cool and that B had given them to him for his birthday. Chifu wasn't deterred as he rushed forward, and quickly dodging the slashing swords that were yearning for the taste of his flesh and blood but only tasted air as the bulky teenager nimbly dodged them, which was surprising for a person of his bulk. Yet another thing En's enemies underestimated about the Kyuubi Jinchuuriki. Impressive, Chifu said for the first time since the death match had started. His face was starting to look a bit ragged, but En thought that was probably because half of his mustache was missing thanks to En's swords. But not impressive enough, Chifu said darkly as En suddenly sensed Circus forming within the man, and he saw the Tao begin to glow orange with hints of red and yellow mixed in the deadly blade. The heated blade slowly started to sink into the light, and thin blades that Karui's father had specially forged for En and his brother for their fighting style. En gritted his teeth before saying, "Don't underestimate me. You're not the only one who can do those tricks." With that said and done, En quickly called forth the ocean of passive chakra flowing through his body and brought it out in a raging tsunami in the form of deadly lighting the color of crimson blood. YRRG! Chifu groaned out as the deadly arcs of crimson lighting raced through his body. His limbs jerked at the high velocity of deadly energy racking through his body. With great willpower, Chifu slowly made a jerky hand sign and held one of his Tao at the ready before pointing the sword tip at En's heart. Lighting sprang to life on the curved blade of the Tao. Bright blue energy crackled and sputtered as the metal turned white from the channeled lighting chakra. Chifu swung down the sword, the tip still pointed at En. Lighting erupted from the sword tip with devastating velocity and size. The deadly arcs of lighting were pure white with faint hints of deep blue along the edges, and didn't have time to react as the spray of lighting struck him. It was only sheer skill and luck that En wasn't immediately barbecued by the deadly technique that could have killed several civilian men if given the opportunity. The white lighting circled around En's bulky form intricately, like a spider web. Suddenly there was hints of crimson sparkling to life, before the entire jutsu faded as a burst of crimson lighting swarmed around En protectively, signifying that the Marital no Yoroi had been activated yet again by the Yatsuki. En looked at the surprised Chifu with a grin, and who wouldn't be surprised? En had to admit that last attack was very deadly, even to him, a master of lighting. This guy certainly deserved to be called powerful at the very least. I'm afraid to say this, but we gotta wrap this up. I got things to do and people to see, so why don't I just call upon my friends and end this, shall we? En rapped yet again as the Marital no Yoroi slowly faded out of existence. Katon, fireball! Yujito had sprung into action at her friend's terribly rhymed words. With only one hand seal, she unleashed a ball of fire the size of a house at Chifu. Besides her, Surai and Mari sprang into action as well, with Mari cracking his knuckles menacingly, and Surai gripping his cane. Chifu formed a hand sign and crossed his arms in an X. The fire swarmed around him but seemed to pass through him as though it had been diverted. With the large amounts of blue chakra swirling around him, it wasn't too hard to tell that he had wrapped a cocoon of chakra around him to redirect the fire away from him. Surai jumped high into the air, his cane held high above him, and as he descended near the scowling Chifu, the faint mirage of chakra floated from his cane. As his feet planted themselves on the ground, Chifu had to roll backwards to avoid being hit in the large cane, and it was a good thing for the criminal too. The ground around where the cane struck cracked before it imploded upon itself and created a crater large enough that even En respected the strength the lithe thief had. Surai wasn't deterred, however, as he rushed towards Chifu, who immediately swung his twin Tao at the thief's head. The two Chunin of Kumogakure and Mari watched as the two men, one a criminal and the other a master thief, swung their respective weapons of choice with the air of a professional who had used their weapons daily, their fight an intricate dance between enemies. Surai gritted his teeth as he held his beloved cane above his face. The twin Tao swords clashed against the wooden pole but did nothing to cut through the hardened wood, or even chip the Kupo family artifact. He twirled his cane in a complete circular motion suddenly in an attempt to make Chifu lose his grip on his very deadly and pointy swords. But Chifu wasn't an idiot, and wasn't disarmed by the rather fast and sly attack. Sly then backed away, narrowly missing the swords that nearly took off his head but instead brushed by a hair's length away from his forehead. He swung his cane at the man who had tried to overtake his home and country, but Chifu batted the deadly cane with his two dao. Chifu then swung a deadly barrage of precise sword strikes, each as fast as lightning and just as sudden, but his opponent was a master thief whose entire life was built upon using his reflexes and athletic abilities. Tsurai dodged each strike gracefully. Either of the deadly strikes came near him as he backed up and moved to the left or right. He didn't trip on any obtruding rocks nor annoying tree roots but instead moved as though he was sliding. Lariat, graggrh. Chifu managed a strangled choke as he felt his throat being crushed by En's metal bracer that wrapped around his arms. Chifu quickly channeled chakra to his legs and jumped far away from the ninja and thieves and landed on a convenient large tree branch, blood dripping from his mouth as he struggled for breath. Heh, and said with a large grin as he stood at Tsurai's side, "Hope you don't mind that we cut in. We can't let you have all the fun." Yujito and Mari appeared by his side as well. Mari beamed at his closest friend and practical brother. He then gave Tsurai a hug. The large man didn't notice his friend's strangled chokes begging him to release him, or the chalked gargles as the master thief struggled to find breath. The Mari is pleased that you distracted the mean man enough for En to get in a deadly hit. This proves that even the mighty shall fall to the power of courage and friendship. The Mari wishes to celebrate this with food as soon as possible. Mari exclaimed childishly, "You!" The strangled rasps of Chifu seemed to echo around the destroyed clearing. Chifu wiped off the stray trails of blood from his mouth. His throat was somewhat healed but still looked like someone had punched him in the throat hard. But he could breathe and speak. And for a ninja, that meant the whole world. And then Yujito saw him form several different hand seals in a very familiar pattern. Their eyes widened as they realized what was about to happen. "Get back!" Yujito yelled to the two members of the thief trio, who didn't seem to understand what was going to happen. At the same time, and charged up his lighting armor and appeared behind the thieves and instantly shined far away from the clearing while Yujito followed his lead. Summoning Jutsu. Chifu roared as he slammed his bloody palms against the dry ground. Immediately the familiar and intricate seal design appeared on the ground for a brief moment before the earth shook and a large cloud easily the size of Gamabunta and Manda's size appeared in the clearing, destroying anything in its path. "Oh, this isn't good," and muttered as he looked up at the gigantic summon who sat there with an aura of power and authority. Chifu standing atop the creature's giant head. "Those are very large claws," Yujito commented as she saw the claws the size of trees gleam in the moonlight. Each individual claw looked ready to slice through stone like it was hot butter. "And teeth," Tsurai added in as he looked at the gaping maw of the creature, whose teeth were the size of buildings and mayhaps even bigger and much deadlier. "Kitty!" Mari yelled out in glee, as only Mari could react to this type of situation in a rather giddy and childish manner. "Chifu!" The deep rumbling growl of Chifu's personal summon echoed throughout the ravine that made up Dorobo with the strength of an avalanche. "Why have you summoned me here, Lord Kunshu?" Chifu said respectfully as he jumped onto the golden snout of the boss summon, looking into the being's gleaming amber eye before bowing ever so slightly as his entire body reflected onto those mirrors of gold with the black slit etching across without blinking. "I humbly ask for your help in defeating these annoying pests." Chifu then glared down at said annoying pests who glared back at him even from such a distance. The boss summon's giant tail hit the ground in thought. The mere twitch of the tail sent trees flying as they were uprooted at the small movement. The boss's claws sunk into the earth as though it was water. The being's golden fur seemed to glow in the darkness while the dark stripes looked like inky ribs running through the golden fur like darkness. The boss of the tiger clan then nodded his head, his amber eyes looking down at the assorted chunin and thieves with a calculating stare, his whiskers twitching as he smelled their scents. Kunshu's eyes then narrowed in concentration as he inhaled deeply and leaned forward before leaning backwards with a puzzled look on his furred face, his ear twitching slightly in thought. "You! One of you smells odd," he muttered, but being a being easily the size of a mountain did little to hid his musings. He then looked at Yujito as though she was the source of his current musing and predicament, and a giant sword-wielding toad would do wonders at the moment. Yujito whispered to the only person in their small group who had a summoning contract, and nodded his head in agreement before quickly biting his thumb hard enough to pierce the skin and draw blood. The Jinchuuriki of the nine-tailed fox then formed the familiar hand seals and with a single cry of summoning jutsu, Their group disappeared in a large plume of smoke that equaled the size of Quinchu's. As the smoke slowly faded away into nothing, everyone was able to see who and what N had summoned. The toad was large, though not as large nor bulky as Gamabunta, who was the boss chief of the Toad clan, but the toad still had the same aura of danger surrounding him, if a bit lessened. With his skin the color of crimson with black markings etched on his eyes, arms, and legs, he looked somewhat similar to the brick-red color of Gamabunta. Both had the same golden reptilian eyes that stared ahead at his enemy with no fear. His ears were shaped like horns instead of what a normal toad's look like, and in his webbed hands was a large Sakazuki shield the color of gold, and a deadly sharp Susumuta in the other. Gamaken, and called down to the crimson-colored summon from atop his marked head, "We need your help." "I shall try and help you, En-sama. Though I may be clumsy, I will try with the best of my ability." Gamaken's deep voice rumbled as he readjusted his grip on his shield and bristled club. "A toad?" Quinchu questioned as he looked at the toad that equaled him in size. The tiger summon slowly got onto his 4 paws and stretched like a normal house cat, but even the simple movement had a certain feline grace that could only be described as predatory. "It's been a while since I've seen one of your kind, young toad. What are Konoha's proclaimed defenders doing here, and being summoned by a mere boy whose forehead sports the symbol of the hidden cloud and not the hidden leaf?" "We toads protect our own, and though I may clumsy and not graceful, I will protect our summoner to the best of my ability. His allegiance to a different village does not matter to us." Gamaken rumbled out as he prepared himself for the death match that was sure to come. The large feline gave the toad a sly smirk, reminding En and Yujito of Nibi whenever she thought of something that often ended up with En and Yujito in rather embarrassing positions that they would rather not speak of without the treat of blushing threatening to darken their cheeks. "Then let's see how this battle shall play out. I am in the mood for a snack, and while I find the taste of toad rather disgusting, I am in the mood for something fresh water." The gigantic and lethal tiger purred out, his amber eyes gleaming hungrily, but when they saw the small form of Yujito, some emotion crossed through his eyes before they disappeared before anyone could figure out what the summon was thinking. Gamaken's golden eyes narrowed at the threat. He hefted his golden and twirled his bristled club in preparation. "En-sama," the great toad of Mount Mayaboku rumbled out, "I suggest that you have your comrades leave this battle. I am clumsy, and they may fall off." "They are not ninja, yes? Lady Yujito may stay, as she is more graceful than I." "I agree," and told the club wielder before looking at the master thieves with a somewhat apologetic look. "Sorry guys, but maybe you should sit this one out. It's hard enough for 2 people to stay on this head, much less 2 more. Surai looked ready to protest, but before the dashing thief could even speak, Mari placed a large beefy hand on Surai's shoulder. "Surai, we should go," the buff man said seriously. "We are of no use to them at the moment. You haven't signed your clan's raccoon contract yet, and neither I nor Bentor have a summon. We should go and fight when we can." "Yeah. Okay, Mari." Surai muttered dejectedly, obviously upset that he didn't have a chance to beat up the man who had tried to take everything from him, and rubbed the deaths of his family in his face on multiple occasions, and grabbed their shoulders and, using his Shushin technique powered by the faintest usage of his lightning armor, teleported them far away from the oncoming summon battle next to Bentor, who had been watching the fight from afar with his binoculars. "Gah!" Bentor yelped in an undignified manner as his 2 best friends and surrogate brothers suddenly appeared out of nowhere in a flash of crimson lighting. There was the faint image of En flashing the smart man a thumbs up before the young Jinchuuriki teleported back to Gamaken's head. "Phew," and wiped off the stray bead of sweat that trickled down his forehead. "Don't make me do that again, it's tiring. How Big Brother can do that all the time is a wonder and a miracle by itself." "Well, the fact that you can move so fast in the space of a couple of seconds is a miracle, though the strain it does on your body should make you reserve it for when you need it. Plus A is more experienced than you in terms of speed and durability," Yujito told her friend, who nodded his head at that, "and he's a badass," and stated seriously with no room for argument in his tone. Yujito laughed at that he is. "Gamaken, you know what to do," and muttered softly as his summon readied himself for the upcoming battle. The clearing was silent aside from the breathing of the gigantic summons. The tiger looked at the toad and the criminal glared at the ninja. Gamaken shifted ever so slightly to the left. Immediately the spell of silence was broken as Quinchu sprang at the giant crimson toad, easily crossing over the large distance with a single bound. His sharp teeth flashed in the moonlight as his claws unsheathed from his paws, itching to pierce Gamaken's thick skin. There was a terrible screeching noise that wailed terribly as Quinchu's deadly sharp claws raked against the side of Gamaken's shield. Despite the sharpness of the tiger's claws, there was barely any markings from the attack. With a grunt, Gamaken used his bronze shield to throw off the giant tiger, sending Quinchu backwards, and the only reason he wasn't flung across the clearing was because he sunk his claws in the dry ground to stop his momentum. Gamaken hopped forward several bounds before using all of his lower body strength to send himself and his summoner and his comrade flying into the air. As he quickly fell back to the ground, Gamaken hefted his bristled two-headed club high above his head as he prepared himself to bash the deadly club into the tiger boss summon's head. With feline grace, Quinchu dodged the attack Gamaken had attempted. The ground split and cracked as it took the full force of the attack and created another crater to join the others. Gamaken then leapt towards Quinchu yet again with his club held high as he hoped to catch the tiger's neck between the two parts of his club. Quinchu's clawed paw slammed into the gigantic toad, sending the warrior of Mount Mayaboku skidding backwards several large bounds, but still remained on his webbed feet. With a grunt, Gamaken did a rather impressive backflip to avoid another sharp claw to the side, and then Yujito holding on to the back of his dark kimono for dear life, and quickly jumped up high in the air and formed a single-hand sign. Water style. Gunshot. Gamaken spat out a large glob of condensed water that was easily as big as his head. The jutsu raced towards Quinchu, whose eyes widened at the fast jutsu, and had no time to react, much less avoid the fast cannonball-like jutsu. Growling. Quinchu growled menacingly, his side dripping wet and his amber eyes burning, but other than that he looked perfectly fine if a bit sore. You got my fur wet. I'll burn you to a crisp. The angered cat hissed, his wet fur bristling as his spine arched as he glared at the toad and his summoner. Quinchu inhaled deeply while Gamaken tensed as he waited for what was about to happen. Cat on, hell cat! Immediately a large inferno of hungry flames erupted from the giant cat's maw. The giant cloud of deadly flames raced towards the toad and humans. Gamaken quickly raised his shield and hid his massive form behind the golden shield, all the while making sure his head, and thus his human companions, weren't being burned to a crisp. The flames hit the shield, but most of the brunt force of the flames were channeled away from them, and while the three may feel like they just got a bad sunburn, it was better than being burned alive by an angry tiger summon. Lighting style. Crimson bolt. And shouted as he aimed one of his palms at Chifu, who stood atop Quinchu's head. Immediately a deadly bolt of crimson lightning arced towards the criminal. Mesmerizing dark blue chakra that looked nearly navy leaked out of Quinchu's paws and around the tips of his sharp claws. Like a house cat would a fly, Quinchu whacked the racing bolt of lighting from the air, and the bolt ricocheted off of the wall of navy chakra and into a mountainside, creating a large explosion. Catan fire claws. The navy blue chakra that swirled around the predator's deadly claws turned a vibrant orange as his life force was turned into the element of fire and flung the deadly jutsu at his enemy. Ugh! Gamaken growled out as he shielded himself again from harm with his trusty shield, but the fierce flames still managed to hit his skin and cause them to burn and blister. Gamaken, are you okay? Anne asked in concern as he saw the blisters starting to form, creating large red welts that clashed with his darker crimson skin. I'm fine, Gamaken croaked out wearily. His left leg, which had taken the most damage by far, was twitching slightly, but the warrior toad was still able to put his weight on it. Though this injury will make me less graceful than ever, I will do everything in my power to win this for you, Ansama. Thanks, Gamaken, Anne said with a slight smile, unable to stop as he was glad that he had a friend and someone who cared so much. You're one of my favorite toads, don't tell Gamabunta though. I'd rather not get hurled off of a mountain. Gamaken then looked at Quinchu, who looked back somewhat smugly, his tail flickering ever so slightly and a soft purr creeping into his deep tone as he spoke. I'd rather finish this now, I have cubs to feed. With surprisingly amazing speed and gracefulness, Gamaken leapt forward yet again, but in a zigzag motion, while Quinchu tensed as he watched the gigantic toad hop around in a confusing pattern. Exploding Susumida attack. Gamaken croaked out as he managed to dodge the slashes of Quinchu's claws and gave the giant tiger a good whack on the side. As the giant tiger was thrown by the strength of the club-wielding toad, the spot where Gamaken had struck suddenly exploded with the power of several paper bombs filled to the brim with chakra. The second the flash of yellow and the roar ended, another explosion took its place as the resulting jutsu created a chain of explosion every single time the other explosion died out. Quinchu hissed in pain, his pelt seared from the explosives and blood threatened to drip where the spiked club had hit him in the side. Ugh! Quinchu hissed in pain as he moved slightly. Chifu, you sure know how to pick 'em. Quinchu then prepared to fight on. That last blow may have injured him, but he was no lightweight. He was the boss summon of the Tiger Clan. He could take little explosions to the side. This battle isn't going anywhere, Yujito thought as she knew that both summons were stubborn to the end and this battle could last for hours and sooner or later collateral damage and civilian casualties would result because of their fight. Something Yujito wished to avoid at all costs. Kitten, Nibi's voice rang in her head, surprising the Jinchuuriki ever so slightly. Nibi, I thought you were asleep. The girl mentally told the giant hellfire cat. There was an extended yawn, and Yujito caught the image of Nibi stretching in her mindscape. Oh, I was, but I must say I'm wide awake now. So what's going on? We're in the middle of a fight. Nibi gasped at this. You got in a fight with your mate? Yujito blinked at this. What? No. We're fighting Chifu, the criminal mastermind, remember? He has the tiger summon. How I don't know. This battle is going to drag on. Why don't you just tell Quinchu to leave? Nibi, I highly doubt that would work. Oh, but it will. It always does. Nibi said happily. What? Yujito asked confused, as she had never heard of this from Nibi before. There was a sigh as though Nibi was annoyed at the fact she wasn't aware of this already. What I mean is that you're my container. I am sealed within you, Yujito. And in case you never noticed, I'm a cat. Nibi explained patiently, and cats, no matter if you're a lion or tiger or a normal house cat, they always look up to the strongest of their kind. Me, you. Wait, is that why cats love me so much? And thinks it's because you're sealed within me, and that they can somehow sense that. Yujito said with dawning realization. Nibi purred in approval. Of course that's why. And's pretty smart. You'd think he'd be the dumb brute, but he is surprisingly very intelligent for a human. Nibi turned serious as she spoke again. Use my chakra, Yujito. Use it and prove to that giant tiger that you're my Jinchuuriki, my container. He will listen to the strongest of the feline race, for I am the two-tailed cat. And they will listen to me, and thus you. Use your chakra? Yujito muttered internally and a bit nervously. She had never used Nibi's chakra outside of the cave. The time fighting with Gaara didn't really count as N had been with her, and there were no other witnesses. But there were now, a whole town looking at them. What if she lost control even for the briefest of seconds? Then Raisin would find out and would be furious, and A would be furious. And those two combined and angry was not a good combination. Could she risk it? Kitten, Nibi spoke softly, don't be so scared. While N and B have the raw power as my brothers are more powerful than me. You have the greatest control, the finesse, the compatibility. Something B and N lack in, for you have been using the one-tailed version your whole life. You just have to use your initial state, then Quinchu will recognize my scent. Easy, okay. Yujito spoke aloud before she turned to N. Quin, back away. I want to try something, and shot her a confused look. What are you going to do? He asked his fellow Jinchuuriki. You'll see. Yujito closed her eyes in concentration. She felt every pulse of chakra flowing through her like a river, but she ignored it. She went towards where the seal was, where an ocean of energy was being held behind the iron walls of her seal. She spun a little like in the iron wall, and she felt the potent chakra wash over her warmly. Her eyes snapped open, her eyes now a gleaming amber, with Narzi chakra slowly pouring out of her body. She then channeled a large amount of the Bijou chakra to her legs and sprang off of Gamaken's snout, and launched herself towards Quinchu. She landed on his furred snout without the tiger trying to bat at her like a fly. Instead, amber met amber, and Quinchu's eyes widened in shock and excitement as he recognized the amber eyes staring at him from behind the humans. He saw for a brief moment the image of the two-tailed cat staring at him from behind the blonde girl, a Jinchuuriki, before it faded away. Nibi! Quinchu rumbled out, sitting up straight as though to show proper manners to the Bijou. It's been a while. You need to stop, Yujito spoke, her voice deepened by the use of Nibi's chakra. Stop now. For a second Yujito thought she saw hesitance light up in Quinchu's eyes. I. The great summon stumbled out, obviously caught between a rock and a hard place. Quinchu knew he had to choose, his summoner or his leader? Quinchu didn't personally like Shifu, but he had been the one to find their summoning contract that had not been used in decades. Though the tiger didn't agree with his criminal acts, he was still loyal at heart. But he was loyal to Nibi even more, for she was the one who had first struck fear in their opponents' hearts. She looked out for them, from the bravest lion to the trembling house cat. Quinchu sighed deeply and flattened his ears till they touched his head. I will stop, he said at last. What? Chifu exclaimed, his tanned face bright red at the turn of events. Lord Quinchu, what is the meaning of this? I may be the boss of the tigers, but even we look up to the two tails. I'm sorry, Chifu, but it's over. Quinchu stated with the air of defeat, but he looked at Yujito with loyalty burning in his amber gaze. No! I refuse! I dash! Chifu never got to finish what he was going to say, because Yujito suddenly appeared in front of him and socked him in the face. Sending the criminal flying off of the predator, and onto the ground. "Chifu, you've lost," Yujito stated as Chifu lost consciousness, and the battle was over. They had won. "Order up!" The croaky voice of Ryochi Kupa rang in the empty sushi restaurant. An old man with silver hair tinged with gray walked towards the counter with several plates of delicious-smelling sushi lined up. Yujito immediately grabbed her favorite rolls and bit into it. She sighed as she ate what must have been the greatest thing she had ever tasted in her life. "And I think I'm going to retire and work here for the rest of my life. Ryochi's sushi is the greatest thing in the world," and looked up from where he had been slurping up some of the miso ramen Ryochi had cooked for him. He too was grinning wildly as he slurped up the long noodles with great gusto. "I agree, Yujito. This place sure knows how we roll," Yujito responded by flicking a grain of rice at his forehead. "Be quiet and don't ruin the moment." She sighed wearily as she shifted in her stool. "This is the first time in what seems like months where we get to relax, if only for a couple of hours. I don't need your stupid raps, they get old." Besides them, Surai was eating his own plate of sushi. "I agree with Yujito, and..." The dashing young thief asserted Yujito's statement, whereas the nibby Jinchuuriki smirked at En and gave the Kupa heir a high five, and rolled his eyes but didn't argue. "So, Chifu's in jail with no chance of escape. The Shadow Daimyo is back on the throne and has given the green light for your clan to be welcomed in this village forever. Your grandfather is back home, safe and sound. What are you going to do?" En asked curiously as he slurped up more noodles at a slightly slower pace. Surai glanced at Bentor and Mari. Bentor fiddled with his goggle-like glasses whereas Mari was eating sushi rolls by the handful. "I guess. Back to a normal life." The Kupayar smirked at that, obviously amused at the notion. "Well, as normal as life as a handsome young thief can go." Yujito laughed at that. "Planning some heists now, are we?" She teased at the charismatic thief with an annoying look. Surai grinned slyly at her. "A heist?" He pretended to ponder the thought with a fist placed against the bottom of his chin. Maybe. Maybe not. That would be telling." The gray-haired man winked at the nibby Jinchuuriki. Yujito and En laughed at that. Knowing Surai, he was planning on robbing all of the daimyos of their gold and priceless jewels. Pretty soon assumed would hear news that everything had been taken, even their clothes. To a Kupa, everything had a price to it. You just had to know where to sell it, so this is it. And said sadly as he drank his cup of tea, once again wishing that Ryochi would come back with them so he could make this amazing cuisine. "Goodbye." "Yeah." Surai slammed his cup of steaming tea on the counter loudly. "But screw goodbyes, we still have a couple more hours at most." "I hate goodbyes, how about a see you soon? You're not going to try and steal from Kumogakure, are you?" Yujito asked wearily, and Yujito nearly shivered at the sly grin Surai Kupa sent them. "Like I said. That would be telling," the man said mysteriously. "Your funeral." And muttered under his breath, knowing full well how heavily fortified the village hidden in the clouds was. His father was the Raikage, and En had spent much of his childhood pranking his father, so he knew how much security was around the village. Here, Surai pressed something into both of their hands. It felt like some sort of heavy paper. They glanced down at their palms to see something navy, but Surai shot them a look. "Not here, do it on the road." Surai smiled warmly at the two chunin of Kumogakure. "It's something to remember us by. So you can tell your grandkids that the greatest thing you ever did in your life was meet the famous three thieves in person." And snorted at that, but he smiled back warmly at the man who had become a close friend. He put whatever Surai had given him into a pocket in his flak jacket, Yujito following him. "Thanks, Surai. It was nice meeting you, all of you." And held out his hand in a fist. Surai smiled at that and fist bumped him. Surai then fist bumped Yujito as well before clasping his friends on the back. "But where are my manners? You don't have to leave yet. Sit down, eat some more sushi or drink, whatever. Just no goodbyes." Surai then sat down on his stool with En and Yujito following his gesture. For the next hour or so, the ninja and thieves sat with one another and ate. All the while laughing at the jokes one made or just warmly chatting with one another, as though they had been friends for years and not just a few months. But as they were clearing the plates, Mari realized something. For the first time since they had ate, Mari spoke. "Surai, are we forgetting something?" The brawn of the three thieves asked curiously, looking up from his comic book that he had brought with him from the now abandoned hideout. Surai narrowed his eyes at that, his brow crinkling in thought. "No, why?" Mari shifted uneasily. He had a look of great concentration on his flushed face as he struggled to remember. "I don't know, I just have a feeling we forgot about something. Something important." He stressed the last sentence with a gesture of his hands. Bentor's face was crinkled in thought as he tried to remember as well. Surai, I think he's right. The certified genius said slowly. Surai's face scrunched at this as he tried to remember what was so important that they had forgotten about it, and was only remembering it now. Slowly realization slowly dawned on his face, leaving him wide-eyed. Oh, he said quickly, guys, you don't think that she's… Bang! The door to the closed end smashed open, the door slamming into the wall with enough force to nearly shatter the aged wood and created spiderweb-like cracks on the old walls. A figure appeared in the doorway, their features hidden in the shadows. To the thieves a very familiar voice yelled at them, while En and Yujito were confused beyond measure. Freeze, Kupa! A woman's voice rang through the quiet room. The figure strode forward with purpose in her stride as her features became known to all of the occupants in the room. The woman was gorgeous. With dark navy blue hair that trailed down to her back leaving only a few fringes on her tanned face, she definitely would have stood out in the crowd, but not in a bad way. Her brown eyes were burning with burning triumph as she stared at none other than Surai Kupa as though he was a prize she had been wanting from a long time. There was a small mole under her left eye that seemed to enhance her beautiful features even more. She wore a light brown jacket that looked rather worn but comfortable, and under it was a short navy blue shirt that didn't cover her stomach and form-fitting navy blue shorts with a belt on it, and brown combat boots. Soft yellow gloves hid her hands, though the fact that they were in a hand sign was slightly alarming. To Surai's credit, it only took a second for the shock to wipe off of his face and instead be replaced with a rather suave expression as he leaned back onto the counter, as though he was in complete ease. Kuruma, he sighed softly yet lovingly, but it still had that classic Surai humor laced within. How can I freeze when my heart warms at the very sight of you? Enough with the stupid flirting, Kupa. Kuruma snapped at the charming thief with anger burning in her brown eyes. I've been tracking you three down for months. Did you think that you could escape my grasp now that I have you? And that's not flirting? Surai asked incredulously with a huge smirk. Kuruma nearly growled as Surai always flirted with her, even when she was ready to unleash volts of lighting into him. Maybe that would wipe that smug smile off of his stupid cute face. All I see is a pathetic thief who's escaped jail for too long. Surai didn't even look hurt. If anything, he looked happy to see the woman who worked on the other side of the law. Oh, so you're taking me to jail yourself? Sounds romantic. As long as you don't mind dining in jail, that is. I'm afraid that the only people you'll be dining with are other criminals, Kupa. Kuruma stated. Nah. On second thought, I hear that the service is lousy. Perhaps another time? Surai asked dashingly. Gah. Kuruma apparently had gotten fed up with the thief, who was very cute, no bad thoughts, and channeled chakra to her already formed hand sign and unleashed a large bolt of lighting from her fingertips and sent it hurtling towards Surai. Surai jumped out of the way and narrowly avoided the jutsu Kuruma often used. It was more of a stun type of jutsu than one that maimed or killed. She was on the side of the law and she fought by the rules. That didn't mean Surai did. Surai suddenly appeared out of nowhere and appeared right in front of Kuruma. With the practiced and experienced hands of a master thief, Surai wrapped his arms around Kuruma's waist and kissed her deeply. For a couple of moments there was complete silence, Bentor and Mari looking at the scene with jaws on the ground and slightly nauseous expressions on their faces. Kuruma's eyes were wide as she found herself being kissed by the handsome thief, and she tried to fight her way out of his strong embrace. But her flushed cheeks told another story. Surai broke contact and looked at the two Jinchuuriki in the eye. Now that's how you do it, he exclaimed. He then looked at the shell-shocked Kuruma. Maybe you two should leave. The two Chunin took his advice and quickly shined away from the sushi house and the trio. As they sprinted out of the valley that held the town of Dorobo, Kuruma's voice rang even miles away. Kuwilapa, and laughed as he heard the faint sounds of explosions after that yell. He'll be fine. We'll see them again. And then placed a hand in his pocket and pulled out what Surai had given them. A navy blue origami shaped as the head of a raccoon seemed to grin at them slyly. Its face wearing its own marked mask, it was the call sign of Surai, saying that they'd meet again, whether with him breaking into their compound and stealing their things or under the terms of friendship. They didn't know, but they looked forward to that day. Goodbyes don't last forever. Chapter 31, Heirs of the Moon. It's so hot. And whined out loud as he glanced around the barren desert, where only his team was the other living inhabitants, seeing as nothing would want to live out here. The air near the barren ground was refracting, making it difficult for a civilian to see the ground. Though since En was a Chunin of Kumogakure, he could easily see through the refractions. But since he was from Kumogakure, widely known for its mountains and snowy terrain, he was not well prepared for the baking heat of wherever they were, which was the middle of nowhere. though En was smart enough to not wear his normal hoodie and instead opted to wear a dark crimson muscle shirt. "We heard you the first time you said that, En," Karui said to the boy with annoyance. Oma looked around nervously. "Oh man, it is hot here. What if there are holes in our water canteens and we didn't notice it until it was all gone and we slowly start to die of dehydration? But not before we start having weird hallucinations, and we'll be driven mad by them." And Yujito lightly whacked the boy upside the head. Omoy had gotten rid of his jacket as well, and instead was wearing a long-sleeved shirt that was dark green. Karui was wearing the same thing she always wore, as she didn't wear a jacket like the others. Now. Darui scolded his teammates lazily. "No need to beat each other up. We'll have plenty of dull moments to fight later." And suddenly squinted as he peered at something in the distance, his mouth clamping on the cherry lollipop Omoy had given him. The others glanced up and saw what appeared to be a cart being pulled by horses slowly come nearer. Sure enough, they could hear the faint neighing of multiple horses and the thundering sounds of wheels rolling on the dry rock. En's hand trailed towards one of his swords, the action being done by the other Chunin. Only Darui didn't reach for his sword. Even then he was wary, but he had a feeling he knew who they were. The caravan of carriages soon approached them. There were dozens of them, all loaded with different items and treasures, though it was hard to tell as most of the things were in large crates. "What the?" Karui questioned with a raised brow as she looked at the long line of carriages being pulled. "What do you think they are transporting?" she asked her friends. "Why, everything I bought," a man's voice said jovially. Suddenly a rather large man tried to make his way out of one of the carriages, which seemed to be the most fancy and ornate, though the man had troubled as his large belly made it hard to get out of the door. The man before them was slightly tanned, had short black hair that was covered by some sort of red fedora. The man was wearing a pristine white robe, with the same bright white and dark ocean blue sash that crossed one another, making intricate designs and patterns. He had a necklace with bright reddish-purplish balls stringed together, as well as another necklace with different crystals. "During my wonderful travels, I feel in love with so many things. So I did a little splurging," the man continued while he gestured towards the many carriages that carried everything from his little splurging trip. "I am the Prince of Moon Country, Suki Michiru." The now-known prince introduced himself before raising a brow at the 2 Konochi and 3 shinobi. "And you 5 are? We are ninja from Kumogakure no Sato. We come on behalf of Lord Raikage, who issued a mission to protect you, Lord Michiru." Darui explained and bowed his head slightly in respect to the noble. There was no need to anger someone who would one day rule a country. "I am the team captain, Darui. This is Ni Yujito." Yujito bowed her head in respect to the man. Karui bowed her head as well. Omo quickly bowed his head, his mind already thinking of different scenarios on how his introduction could go wrong. And Yatsuki En gave the man a peace sign. "Yo!" he greeted happily. "My team and I will guard and protect you until you safely return home." "Do not worry, you and your escorts are in capable hands," Darui assured the prince. "Ah, good. I hope you will last longer than my previous guards," Maruchi said idly as he looked at the Cloud team. Before anyone could ask why, Maruchi suddenly smiled even more and walked up to Yujito. He bent his head slightly as he inspected the confused Nibi Jinchuuriki. My, you're pretty cute," he said happily, not noticing the surprised looks of Yujito and her teammates. "Are you sure you're a ninja? You're such a cutie." Maruchi softly grabbed Yujito's hands and held them in his own. Yujito was too surprised to do anything, and she also knew she couldn't exactly hit the prince, because he was a prince and burning him to a crisp would bring a lot of political trouble, and she really didn't want to piss off Raisin. "Hey ga!" Darui had stopped En from charging forward. En's face had turned bright red and he was struggling to get out of his sensei's iron grip. "Let me go, sensei," he hissed under his breath. "En, don't do something you'll regret, be dull," Darui hissed back. En huffed something under his breath before relaxing. Darui released him warily in case the hot-headed Jinchuuriki tried anything. Maruchi had noticed En's outburst, and had wisely let go of the annoyed Yujito's hands. En heard a projectile coming near his head and quickly plucked it out of the air before it would have hit his Kumogakure Haitate. It was an arrow, or to be correct, a toy arrow with a suction cup instead of a real arrowhead. En looked at where the arrow had come from to see a small boy holding a small bow. "How did you do that?" the boy demanded. "That should have been able to kill you," En snorted at that. "Kid, if I was killed by a brat like you with a fake arrow, I would deserve to die. Next time try a real arrow, with a dozen explosive tags on it. Maybe then you may scratch me." The small boy stepped out of the same carriage Michiru had come out of. He had the same short black hair as Michiru. He wore black glasses and he had a similar outfit to the prince, which was a white robe with blue triangular trimmings held closed by a simple sash. He also wore brown boots. A quiver filled with more fake arrows was on his back. "Father, who are these people?" the boy demanded to Michiru. "I don't like them, especially the one in those stupid red shades." "Hey, don't diss my shades!" and roared at the boy. "These things are sharp, just like my blades." The boy cast a bored look at the Chunin. He seems to be a bit on the dumb side as well. Yujuto, Omoi, and Karui had to hold them back as he tried to get closer to the boy to hit him across the whole country. Michiru noticed the tension and quickly intervened before things got ugly. "This is my son, Hikaru. Please forgive him if he offended you," and growled and shoved his friends off of him. He took a deep breath to calm himself and managed to put on a strained smile to look at the prince's son. "Nice to meet you," he managed to say before raising a brow and looked at his outfit. "What's up you and your pops wearing all that blue?" Darui rolled his eyes while Karui and Yujito's eye twitched, and as when they whacked the boy upside the head for his odd way of speaking, Omo merely chuckled and unwrapped another lollipop before sticking it in his mouth and discreetly edging away from the annoyed females. Hikaru's face scrunched up slightly, seeing as blue was a common color to the people of Moon Country, seeing as it signified both the sky and the ocean and was a color many nobles wore. Seeing as both he and his father were heirs to the throne, it made sense to have the pale blue color. He also realized that none of the five were wearing any type of blue, the closest being that one of the girls had blue eyes. All of them, including the adult, wore darker colors. The eldest of them all, Hikaru couldn't tell his age due to his white hair, but he looked around the early to mid-20s, seemed to be the one in charge. All of them had the same bright white flak jacket that he assumed had something to do with their nation. He had once seen a Konoha shinobi, and they had the same thing but different in shape and color. The leader, the redhead, and the one who either had a cigarette or maybe a lollipop, wore dark gray or black clothes even though it was burning outside. The brightest of them was the weird one with the shades. He wore a dark crimson shirt that did nothing to hide his muscles, and the other girl wore a dark purple t-shirt and black ninja pants. "Are you sure these guys can protect us, father?" Hikaru asked, not at all impressed or awed by the shinobi, especially the one whose hair was a very bright blonde. "What if they're useless like the others? I'm sure you'll find us different from the other dull guards you've hired in the past, Hikaru," Darui assured the young boy. Seeing as Darui had been a jonin for a long time and had gone on hundreds of protection missions, he was used to some of the clients being less than courteous than some, especially the rich ones. Thus he wasn't annoyed in the slightest by the boy, something that N was already trying hard not to throw a couple kunai or shuriken at them, though that was probably because Yujito had realized that when she saw his expression and has thus taken his pouch filled to the brim with the deadly sharp weapons. "You win this round," and grumbled to his best friend, who merely smirked at the other blonde Jinchuuriki. "But can I at least make the kid taste the dirt from the ground?" "No," Yujito whispered back, making N fall into a cloud of depression, and shot a small look at Hikaru, who was already heading back to the carriage with his father, before sharing a glance with his comrades before all of them nodded in a silent agreement, an agreement that they would uphold the image of the cloud and what it stood for. That meant no punching annoyances through walls even if you really wanted to, in N's opinion at least. Luckily for Hiraku there were no walls. EUHDIHDJ, and knew immediately that the cliffs they were walking through was probably teeming with bandits, and down on their luck Ronin, eagerly waiting for the rich prince of Moon Country to appear with his carriages and wealth, an easy picking for a ransom and everything the prince and heir to the throne currently possessed. With the obvious threat, all of the cloud shinobi felt their hands instinctively drift towards the hilt of their respective blades. Even Darui-sensei was ready to summon his cleaver sword via a sealing tattoo hidden on his hand. Sure enough, when they were halfway through the cliffs, bandits and Ronin alike slid down the steep slope, armed to the teeth with a different and exotic assortment of weapons. Immediately the cloud shinobi rushed to face their attackers, and it was soon quite obvious who was outmatched. Karui easily ducked under a hasty slash aimed for her throat by a scarred man wielding a rather wicked-looking scythe. Spinning slightly, she dodged a spear that would have been lodged in her gut. With the skill and expertise of someone who trained in kenjutsu every day, Karui disarmed the scythe wielder and sent the man running. Karui backed up slightly as the one wielding the spear rushed forward, the sharp tip aimed for her heart. With a quick slash, Karui cut the spear clean in two, leaving the deadly part to fall to the dusty ground and for the attacker to suddenly find himself with a sword in the gut. "Oh man, oh man," Omo muttered as he jumped high in the air to avoid a rather blood-crazed sword wielder. His dark hands went towards one of his leg pouches and he grabbed shurikens and threw them at his attacker with deadly accuracy. What if these guys were actually good guys and were sent by the leader of Moon Country to protect his son, and we just started an international incident, and we will forever be known as the people who brought the downfall of Kumo and the bringers of the Fourth Shinobi War? A man who had been rushing towards the still wondering Omoe was immediately kicked off the mountain by Yujito. Oma! Fight now, ponder about life and its meanings later. The blonde Jinchuuriki yelled over her shoulder as she rushed towards a group of thugs with blunt clubs, her tanto held at the ready. Yujito ducked under the largest man's club, bending backwards until both her feet and arms were touching the ground. With feline grace, Yujito used her upper body strength to vault herself upwards, her sandaled feet crashing into the giant club and sending both the weapon and the owner flying through the air and off the cliff, a small dust cloud forming upon his painful impact. Another man with a spear who had been charging at the young Jinchuuriki suddenly fell to the ground dead, a shuriken stuck upon the back of his head. Yujito's gaze snapped towards the one who had thrown the ninja stars and saw Karui give her a brief nod before dashing back into the fray. Man, you guys need to chill out, Darui commented lazily as he leaned backwards slightly as a sword as long as Zabuza's and just as wide missed his neck by an inch. The wielder, a man who looked like he could lift a mountain, roared in frustration and rushed forward, his attacks becoming a blur. Darui merely continued to duck and dodge, the same air of laziness surrounding the powerful Jonin. The only thing the deadly weapon struck was the rock, giant slashes and crumbling earth, the only sign of the fighting. You should train more, otherwise you just get as dull as that sword of yours, Darui said as he noticed the blade had several stains of rust lining the edges, something no respectable swordsman, at least one from the cloud, would ever think to do. Darui's cleaver sword sliced through the large sword like a hot knife through butter. The lazy Jonin hefted his large blade up to the petrified man's neck. The edges seemed to gleam in the sunlight. My blade, on the other hand, Darui shoved his cleaver sword into the criminal's neck, is not dull in the least, and had made sure that once the ambush had started he stayed close to the heir to the throne and his bratty kid. Seeing as they were the targets, it made sense that he would stay close by, and had already punched several bandits off of the cliff, sending them to plummet off the dangerous rocks without hesitation, and back flipped as a mace cracked the ground where he had been a second ago. He ducked under a fist and punched the man square in the face, making him fly through the air. North kept himself close to the carriages far below them. He knew that the bandits had a bit of brain matter among them, as they had tried to lead him away from the carriage, but they should have realized that despite acting like an idiot most of the time, he was actually pretty smart, and saw himself surrounded by 5 bandits, each leering at him, while he looked at the supposed challenges with a bored expression. Man, even with protecting an heir to the throne, things are still so drone. These guys don't hold a candle against my old opponents. And paused momentarily as he tried to figure out a good word that rhymed with candle. Hold on, he told the bandits as he raised a single finger to ask for a moment. He then quickly got out his trusty notebook that held all of his rhymes for future references. He also got out a pen and started to mutter to himself while writing some words down. Let's see. Sandal? No, too random. Scandal? Maybe. He crossed out the 2 words with his pen. The bandits just stood there and looked at the teenager with bulged eyes, unable to believe that this guy had just stopped a certain death match, to them at least, and was writing poetry, and snapped at the person who had dared say the word poetry. I ain't no poet. You should know it. And then snapped his finger. Handle. That rhymes with candle. Get em. The lead thug roared as all 5 charged towards N, who merely sighed. He formed 2 hand seals and slammed his palms against the ground. Right done. Electromagnet murder. He yelled as dangerous volts of crimson electricity flooded his body before flowing out into the ground and electrocuting the thugs. Their bodies fell limply to the ground, their bodies twitching as the residue lighting continued to course through them. Too easy breezy, and mused before shaking his head. No more breezy in rhymes, he said as he wrote that in his book. Days passed as the caravan slowly trekked through the summer heat, while N and the others continued to defend the royal heirs against bandits and shinobi alike. It was challenging, but thanks to their skill and amazing teamwork, the Kumogakure shinobi and Kunoichi made it look like child's play, and glanced up at the pavilion tent that had been set up. Lord Michira and his son were currently dining on what could only be cuisine fit for a king. Bright red lobsters gleaming with butter, filet mignon bursting with juices topped with expensive spices. Not to mention fine wine and ale flowing like water, and pfft, no wonder those guys look like they need a proper workout. That's just unhealthy, he commented as he slurped up his instant ramen with fervor. Yujito ate her own noodles besides him. Calm down, Enkun. So what if the prince and his kid are a bit rude? No need to make fun of them. Karui snorted as she leaned against her backpack, having already finished her food. Oh come on Yujito, she told her childhood friend. They wouldn't last a single day in our sandals. Omu looked concerned as he unwrapped a new lollipop and plopped it in his mouth. What if the prince and his son do become shinobi? And they're too pampered and unhealthy to fight well and they die? The king of Moon Country would be furious and blame their deaths on us, or more specifically our home. And then we'd go to war. But since we're one of the great shinobi nations, we beat them so easily all the other countries would call it a slaughter and band together to defeat us. Which would end in a bloody war where I'm the only human survivor and I'm doomed to spend the rest of my days remembering better times where my only companion is sure. Karui threw her discarded ramen cup at Omo, a piece of beef sticking to his white spiky hair. Shut up Omo. That'd never happen. Calm down you four, Darui said from where he leaned against one of the many wagons, his dark brown eyes scanning the darkness for any would-be assassins. You remember that Lord Raikage told us to protect Prince Michiru without lives. If we succeed we could possibly gain a new ally, and Moon Country is a very wealthy country. Being allies with them would be beneficial to our home village. Sorry Captain Darui, the four Chunin muttered. A harsh wind blew through, chilling everyone to the bone. A normal civilian would have shivered, but being from the village hidden among the clouds, the five trained killers were used to the frigid atmosphere, and nearly welcomed it after a day of walking in the baking heat. Yujito scooted closer to En, their sides touching. En's hand trailed down and fell on his fellow Jinchuurikis. The two looked at each other and smiled as they held hands, both grateful to each other's body warmth, even though they weren't terribly cold. So, you guys going to tell us what happened between you two and Lord Raikage? Karui suddenly asked as she took a bite out of her jerky. Oma looked at the two with interest, having wondered the same thing as well. Yujito sighed as she leaned against En. Nothing happened, she said curtly. Just a normal mission debriefing. Their fellow Chunin looked at them with disbelieving looks. En rolled his eyes, but couldn't help it when his mind wandered back to their mission debriefing with his father. Flashback 2 weeks ago, and that is what happened. Raisin raised a single dark brow as his youngest son finished his story about their supposedly somewhat simple solo mission together. The third Raikage looked at the two blonde Jinchuuriki for several long seconds before he spoke in his normal gruff tone. So, Chifu is now in prison? And nodded his head. Yes, father. He has been sent to one of the most infamous prisons in the entire elemental nations. Not even someone with his wits and cunning could even hope to escape. He's going to be stuck in there until he's old and gray. The summoning contract, where is it? The Raikage asked curiously, seeing as how rare it was to just stumble upon a summoning contract was. Kumo itself only had a few contracts with summoning animals, and all of them were only available to those in the clan, such as the Aobuyoki clan that held the bear contract. Yujito held up the contract and gently placed it on their leader's desk. Raisin leaned forward to get a closer look. The large scroll looked like it had to be a century old, perhaps more considering how long there has been summoning contracts. The scroll had the symbol of a tiger head that stared at him with eyes made of orbs of amber. The handles of the scroll were the color of burning gold. Raisin slowly unraveled the scroll, noticing with interest a few names that were written in it with blood marks underneath. Most were the color of faded crimson, meaning that the summoner had long since passed. Only one name wasn't crimson but black, signifying that there was a live summoner that had been allowed to use the contract. He looked at the name that was written with smooth and fancy calligraphy. Tora Chifu. Raisin wondered if the man's surname was real or just one he had taken when he had been accepted in the Tiger clan as their summoner. To his surprise, the words were now a dull crimson color. Raisin glanced back up, looking at his son and surrogate daughter with his oddly colored eyes. I thought you said Chifu was still alive? He asked with a slightly scrunched forehead, and shook his head. He is. The boss of the Tigers, Kuinshu, declared that he was no longer allowed to summon himself or his kin. He declared that the bond between them was broken and had removed him from the contract. That's why the color is like that. But what about? Raisin trailed off as he looked at the lone black kanji and bloody fingerprints. His eyes widened. Niyujito. The third Raikage looked back up at the two blondes. His son was smirking deviously at him, which made him wearily think of a fox. Yujito just grinned like a Cheshire cat. He pointed at her. He glanced back down at the contract, wondering if his old age was finally getting to him, and nudged Yujito, who then immediately formed 3 familiar hand seals and with a bite to her thumb hard enough to draw blood, slapped her palm down on the aged wood that was the Raikage's desk. Summoning jutsu. There was a small puff of smoke, and the stacks of paper that somehow managed to dwarf the manliest Raikage with its innocent sheets of paper went flying all over the room. On the desk the smoke cleared to reveal a tiger cub. The cub was the size of a medium-sized dog, its fur the color of beaten gold, and its dark stripes the color of obsidian. The tiger cub looked around in confusion, no doubt wonder how he had suddenly appeared in one of the offices of one of the elemental nation's greatest warrior and kage. Its amber eyes stared into the oddly colored green and black eyes of the third before it opened its mouth as though to roar. Instead of roaring, the cub merely yawned so softly that it would have made any amount of fangirls scream kawaii. Luckily for the residents of the village hidden in the cloud, fangirls were a rare and far sight as being a militaristic superpower. As said fangirls found themselves put to their limits, and realized their potential, and stopped being the most annoying people in the universe. Huh. Raisin said after a couple of silent seconds, his calculative gaze locking into the cub's curious gaze. Not at all affected by the adorable cub, honestly. Yujito murmured to herself, don't any of you Yatsukis have any emotions? He's adorable, you have to admit it. When Raisin looked at the Nibi Jinchuuriki blankly, she sighed, hard ass. She muttered under her breath, and heard it, and snickered. The cub suddenly disappeared in a puff of smoke, no doubt returning to the jungles that the Tiger clan called home as Yujito cancelled to the jutsu. How did you get permission to sign that contract? Raisin asked curiously, knowing full well how rare it was for a summon to allow a stranger to sign their contract. Yujito shifted nervously, knowing full well she couldn't say she was able to sign the Tiger contract because she was the Nibi Jinchuuriki, who was also on speaking terms and could be considered a friend of said Nibi, and since both her and the Bijou worked together, Kunshu had deemed her worthy to sign his contract. He had stated it would be an honor for the holder of their most admired feline. Yujito nearly withered under the piercing stare the Raikage was giving her. He may have been nearly 75 years of age, but let it not be said that the third Raikage was anything but intimidating. Luckily for the young blonde Jinchuuriki, and came to her rescue. She's good with cats? And said rather weakly as he too withered under the piercing gaze of his father. The Yatsuki clan head looked at his son and surrogate daughter with a weary look in his eye before he sighed wearily. Teenagers, he muttered under his breath. Get out of here, both of you. He finally spoke as he leaned back in his chair. Before I throw N out the window, honestly can't one mission go right with you two? He asked aloud, and bristled at the mentioning of being thrown out the window. He had been thrown out of it many times, and he rather didn't like those meetings with gravity, but couldn't help but grin at the last part. Ah, Pops, you know us. Normal missions explode in our faces, but good thing that we're tough. Raisin and Yujito looked at him in disbelief. That was terrible, Raisin said bluntly, whereas N seemed to deflate at his father's harsh, yet true statement. TCH, hard ass. He muttered to himself, but unfortunately his father heard it quite easily. Raisin's body twitched in annoyance. What was that? He asked in an innocent enough tone, though the fact that he had started to crack his knuckles ominously made N pale quickly. But she called you a hard ass. And couldn't help but complain like a 3-year-old, pointing an accusing finger at Yujito. How come I get in trouble? Because it's you, N, Raisin said to his son truthfully, and deflated yet again, a storm cloud appearing above his head. Yujito and Raisin grinned at one another in smug triumph. N flashed back. Karui blinked when N finished telling them what happened. Finally, after a couple moments of complete silence, the redhead simply said, Your family is weird, N, and shrugged his shoulders nonchalantly at her statement. Many people would agree with you. Karui and Omoi's sweat dropped at that, though seeing as they had spent many days in their childhood playing at the Yatsuki clan compound, they knew how odd and different the Yatsuki family was to a normal family. Though then again, both doubted there was such thing as a normal ninja family, and, meanwhile, had returned his attention to his fellow Jinchuuriki and teammate, Yujito-chan, and murmured in her ear so nobody else could hear them. I have to tell you something. What? And opened his mouth, but before he could say anything Darui called out. And go scout out the perimeter. I'll relieve you of duty in a couple of hours. The rest of you get some sleep. I have a feeling this mission won't be dull. And frowned at the interruption but looked back to Yujito when she squeezed his hand. Tell me later, okay, Enkun? The boy nodded his head as he got up, his crimson shades gleaming in the moonlight. He started to walk away towards the perimeter, his hand held on one of his sword hilts. As he stealthily made his way around the caravans, his feet not even making the smallest of rustles, and never noticed that the young Prince Hikaru was watching him from the pavilion with narrowed eyes. Chapter 32, The Finer Things in Life. And leaned back against the rough wooden benches, he offered his snack to Yujito. Popcorn? He offered as he munched on the buttery and salty goodness that he had gotten from one of the various food vendors. Yujito took him up on his offer and got herself a handful. Aren't we supposed to be escorting the heir of a nation back to his nation? she questioned, instead of watching a circus? Karui offered from where she sat, munching of a glob of saltwater taffy. Beside her Olma just unwrapped another one of his lollipops, looking at the color and assumed it was mango. Yujito munched on the last few pieces of En's popcorn. Yeah? Something like that. Olmoy shrugged. They wanted to see the circus, and we can't exactly boss them around and tell them what to do and what not to do. I like my head where it is, he said as he watched the clowns whacking each other with giant mallets with interest, and glanced up to where Michiru and Hikaru were seated. Seeing as they were royalty, they had been given their own cushioned chairs that had probably been in one of the wagons. Michiru was laughing at the display of exotic animals and performances. Even Hikaru was looking somewhat happy about being in the circus. Judging by his sensor skills, Darui was located high above the crowd where he could keep a lookout for any assassins. He had let the Chunin take a small leave and enjoyed the circus, something they appreciated. Yeah! Who go red? And yelled as he stood up and pumped his fist in the air mimicking the boxing kangaroos. One was wearing red boxing gloves while the other wore blue. It was obvious that En was supporting the red-gloved one. Yujito rolled her eyes but couldn't help but smile at En's happy attitude about the circus. Boys, she thought with a grin. Always loving the violence. However, the thought was completely gone when she saw the other figure right next to En yelling with the same fervor she couldn't help but sweat drop at the scene. Come on, Blue, kick that red kangaroo's ass. Karui yelled down to the boxing kangaroos. Or rump or tail. Oh, who the hell cares, kick his furry bottom. I got 10 Ryo on this. Omoy shared a glance with Yujito. His clamped lips formed a grin as he rolled his eyes. Yujito smiled as well. Some things never change. Gah! Karui groaned as she saw the kangaroo with the red gloves knock out the kangaroo with the blue gloves. Beside her En crowed in victory before he turned around with his palm open. With a glare as hot as the pits of hell, Karui gave En the 10 Ryo. Before she punched him in the arm, sending him crashing into the stands. She sat down with a huff, refusing to look at the amused Omoy and Yujito. The next act quickly followed. A rather short clown appeared, decked out in a bright orange wig and crazy makeup. His purple-painted lips were stretched into a creepy grin as he jumped on a trampoline before landing right on a giraffe's head. Omu noticed Karui shiver as 2 other clowns got close to their seats, each trying to spray each other with their flowers that squirted water. Their painted faces stretched into wide grins while the crowd roared in laughter. When Karui saw his confused look, she shook her head and mumbled something. What? The white-haired boy asked the Quinochi, his head turned towards her in order to hear her over the roar of the crowd. Karui's blush was the same shade of her hair. I said I don't like clowns. She mumbled. Omoy's eyes widened at that. You're afraid of clowns? He asked in disbelief. Since when was Karui scared of anything? To think she was afraid of clowns was odd. Karui punched him in the shoulder, making him wince and rub it tenderly. Shut up! She hissed. If En or B-sensei find out about that, they'd never let it go. Omo instantly shut up about Karui's phobia of clowns. He knew how much B-sensei and En would go to tease her. No doubt they'd make a mixtape with raps about clowns. For once he agreed with Karui. Suddenly the lights went out as the clowns and animals left the ring. A single spotlight shined on the ringmaster. A rather tall and pale man wearing a dark maroon suit complete with a red top hat called out to the crowd of onlookers. Ladies and gents, boys and gals, this is the moment you've all been waiting for, he cried out, his voice sounding slightly teasing and mystical as the crowd watched on with anticipation. It's time for the rare Siberian tiger to make its appearance. He lifted his hands as the spotlight went out. Suddenly lights of all colors spun around the circus tent. Somewhere above them a person was playing a drum roll. 3 large spotlights trailed to the background of the stage. There stood a majestic pale tiger with 2 fangs the size of sabers. His golden amber eyes looked at the crowd with almost a bored expression, his whiskers twitching slightly before he growled deeply. And noticed Hikaru staring at the tiger in awe. Suddenly the rare tiger roared, his head thrown upwards. Several small children shrieked, and the Chunin noticed Prince Michiru jerk backwards, several different types of candy spilling from his hands onto the floor. The 3 combined spotlights followed the tiger, as he made spectacular leaps from post to post. The tiger finally landed next to the ringmaster, who gestured towards the tiger and announced through the static, "Behold, Cham." The ringmaster announced before continuing, and Cham's partner, Kiki. One of the spotlights light up on a small monkey, swinging from rope to rope. The monkey was rather small and wore a red cap on his head and a yellow bow of the tip of his tail. The monkey did some flips as it went from rope to rope, before finally landing on Cham's head. The crowd, most noticeably the children, cried out at the cute monkey who waved his arms around and bowed multiple times to different sections of the crowd. Cham merely sat there proudly. Please enjoy their spectacular performance, the ringmaster called out to the crowd before getting out of his ring, and then the others enjoyed the show the majestic tiger and the little monkey put on. Despite their different sizes, Cham and Kiki were very great partners. The two swept a large green ball back and forth, Kiki jumping up high in the air and using his little fist in a downward swing while Cham would bump his nose against the ball, sending it upwards towards the little monkey. Sometimes he would use his back feet or one of his front paws to hit the ball. The crowd roared its applause, some laughing at the little monkey who had to be on a raised platform barely a few inches wide in order to reach the ball. The next performance was much more dramatic than the two animals hitting a ball back to one another. One of the circus folk had lighted several metal rings on fire before putting them together. Cham didn't even hesitate as he leapt through them, using his amazing strength to jump through the burning rings without trouble, and noticed the odd look on Hikaru's face as he watched Cham. For some reason the young Chunin couldn't help but feel troubled by that. After he had made the daring leap through the lighted rings, Cham jumped back on the platform and roared several times at the crowd, whose yelling and applause nearly blocked out the music. The crowd roared in laughter as Kiki jumped onto Cham's back holding an apple nearly the same size as himself, taking what appeared to be a large bite for the monkey, but it barely made a dent in the fruit altogether. Kiki threw the fruit high in the air. It hung there for a moment, suspended from gravity. And then suddenly an arrow pierced into it and stuck to the wall. The archer bowed to the impressed crowd as the music reached its end. The next one won't be so easily, the ringmaster cried out to the audience, the ancient speakers crackling with static. Hikaru watched the ring with interest and awe at the exotic animals. Besides him, his father had gotten another snack and was in the process of devouring it. The only people seated near them were servants who were fanning the heirs to the throne, seeing as there was no air conditioning in the tent. Kiki had been given another apple and was spinning it on one of his little fingers, an impish grin of his furry face. Cham slowly reared upwards until he was balanced on his hind legs. Both the tiger and the monkey swayed slightly. If he misses, Kiki will be in terrible danger, the ringmaster cried out to the now silent and anticipated crowd. Besides him, the archer had notched another wickedly sharp arrow to his bowstring and took aim. There was another drumroll as the archer focused in on the swaying and spinning apple. Kiki and Cham continued to sway to the beat. Either seemed that scared of the arrow that was soon to fly. There was the sound of a bowstring being released. The crowd gasped in shock as an arrow hit the small apple, but instead of a sharpened end to the arrow there was instead a suction cup. The non-punctured apple bounced on the dusty caked in dirt, and gagged on his water as he recognized the toy arrow. Oh hell no. Please tell me that wasn't who I thought it was, he said in shock that the little brat had the audacity to interrupt the performance just to show off. Almost sighed, yeah it was. He too recognized the arrow. The memory of one of the same arrows having tried to stick to En's head just only a couple days ago, that signified the arrival of the second in line to the throne of Moon Country. By then the crowd had gone silent as they realized that wasn't part of the show. The archer, whose arrow was still notched in the bowstring, and the ringmaster were openly gaping at the toy arrow that had managed to hit the small moving target. A spotlight moved to who had shot the arrow. The whole crowd was fixed upon the boy with the bow. Hikaru slowly lowered his bow and shut his eyes, with a small smirk that reminded and way too much of a certain duck-butt-haired Uchiha Imo from Konoha. Hikaru softly and smugly said, "That was too easy." To the credit of the maroon-dressed ringmaster, he quickly recovered from the surprising turn of events. "That was amazing, young man," the man yelled into the microphone so that everyone could hear. The ringmaster clapped his hands in applause, before giving the black-haired boy a small impish grin. "But what about this one?" he asked as he snapped his fingers in a signal. Seeing the signal, Cham and Kiki immediately stood back up. Kiki, having been given another apple, quickly started to spin it on his finger. The circus music from before started again, but at a much faster tune. Suddenly Cham jumped down from the raised and colorful platform and started to quickly run around in a circle, Kiki managing to stay upon the saber-fanged tiger's head with surprisingly ease. "How about it, young man? If you can hit this one, I'll give you a reward," the ringmaster told Hikaru. Hikaru didn't say anything. He merely grabbed another toy arrow from his quiver and notched it in his small bow. The son of the prince watched as Cham raced around the circular platform, waiting for the right moment. His amber eyes fixated upon the small fast-spinning apple, and then Hikaru let go of the string. The toy arrow flew out and raced towards the small monkey holding the apple. With a small pop, the arrow's suction cup smacked into the apple and caused it to fly out of Kiki's grasp and bounce and roll on the dusty floor. And raised a brow. For someone Hikaru's age to hit such a small moving target was impressive, for a spoilt prince anyway. and could have hit that with both his eyes closed, and using only his pinky and a rusty malformed shuriken. The crowd immediately started to cheer for the boy, who merely lowered his bow and shifted his quiver slightly. Besides him, his father gaped at his son, his royal jowls jiggling slightly as he grinned. "Oh, that was amazing, Hikaru-kun," the first in line to the throne said in a tone while clapping that made all of the Chunin, and even Darui, shudder violently as the image of certain blonde and pink-haired fangirls squealing came into their minds. The ringmaster came over to the royalty. "Say you have good aim," he said jovially. "I'm impressed. You have a good eye, my friend." Hikaru merely closed his eyes and clamped onto his small bow. "That was nothing," he muttered. "Still, you beat my challenge. I need to give you a reward," the ringmaster mused as he scratched his beard thoughtfully. "I want that," Hikaru announced and pointed at what he wanted rather bluntly. "Eh?" The ringmaster gaped as he saw where the young prince was pointing at, and it was none other than Cham the Siberian tiger. The ringmaster stuttered, unable to explain to the boy on why exactly he couldn't take the wild tiger home with him. "Well, Cham's really big, and he isn't exactly a pet. He's dangerous, not to mention," the ringmaster said with a worried look, "he's a very important asset to the circus. Many people come just to see him. Siberian tigers are very rare, you know." "No, I want that," Hikaru said stubbornly while the ringmaster looked at him in disbelief. Hikaru turned his head to his father, who was drinking a goblet of fine wine. "Papa, is it okay?" Michiru finished the last drop of his beverage before grinning at his young son. "Sure. To be honest, I've grown a certain likeness to this circus," he said, his face slightly flushed. "I'll buy the whole circus," he announced. The ringmaster's jaw dropped to the ground in shock. Yujito turned her attention from the royals back to her fellow comrades who had the same look of disbelief on their faces. "Don't tell me he just bought a whole circus on a whim," she pleaded them, screwing her eyes shut as she rubbed her temples in an attempt to get rid of the oncoming migraine, and ate some more of his popcorn, the look of disbelief still etched in his tanned features. And sighed. "He just bought a circus on a whim," Carrie groaned, "and seeing as these guys aren't the most responsible of people, we're probably going to have to take care of all these circus animals, right?" The assorted Chunin groaned wearily. "Right?" After the ringmaster discovered that Michiru was in fact dead serious, he immediately decided what any sane man would do, and stood behind Michiru as a guard while the second in line for the throne wrote a very large and expensive check which N had no doubts had a lot of excess money as a tip. He doubted the circus was that expensive. With that type of money he could have as much ramen as he wanted 24/7 without worry, something near impossible in the ramen addict's mind. The ringmaster seemed to notice this as well, if his shaky knees were anything to go by. His face twitching slightly in excitement, his slender fingers were turning white as he clutched his maroon top hat with as much force as he could muster. Behind him some of the circus performers were looking at the check in shock, having never seen so many zeros on a check in their whole lives. "You'll be paid in cash when we return home in Moon Country," Michiru explained as he handed the ringmaster the check. The ringmaster seemed to choke on his words. Instead he merely continued to bob his head in an effort to show his thanks, his lips and facial features still twitching. And Michiru clapped his hands as a signal for the Chunin to come forward. Said Chunin had to fight back a scowl as Michiru summoned him like one of his servants. "Please help Ringmaster-san load up all the animals. Tell your comrades as well." One of the cleanup crew handed him a spade and a bucket. En's nose curled at the disgusting smell emitting from the rusty bucket. His features turned a nauseating green as he tried not to hurl. He turned his attention to the circus lackey, who had the decency to look somewhat apologetic. "You can be on pooper-scooper duty," he said before going to help load in the animals, and glanced back at the bucket and spade and gagged. He stalked away from the laughing prince with a scowl. "Stupid rich dude, making me pick up poo," he said angrily, his rhymes making its trademark appearance, and had never realized until then how much animals had to go number 2. And then decided something. He hated circuses. He noticed Karui helping some of the lackeys herd in a hairy elephant into its cage, and noticed sullenly that she didn't have a bucket or spade on her person. He saw Omoy and Yujito carrying what looked like prairie dogs into their cages. One of them appeared to not like Omoy, if his haggard appearance was to be considered. His stark white hair was in an even more disarray, his dark cheeks sporting several bleeding cuts, and the prairie dog responsible had somehow gotten his lollipop and was nibbling on it. He noticed it was Cherry, Omoy's favorite, and Omoy was glaring at the prairie dog with so much anger only a sugar addict could have, and scowled before going to one of the cages. One of the bison, who he swore had just gone, had left him another present, sometimes, and wondered why he hadn't gone into some other type of business. Hikaru was following his father through the packing circus, Behind them the ringmaster was still giving his father his thanks. Well, I can't give up the opportunity to perform in the Moon Country. I have never been there before. But I've heard the sights are spectacular, and the people are so kind. Michiru smiled jovially at the ringmaster, whose was now under his employ. Oh yes, Moon Country is one of the most beautiful countries in the world. You should see the beaches, sand as pure as snow and the ocean the most darkest and lushest of blue. When the sun sets it looks as though the sand had been turned into gold, and the ocean looks like it had turned into so many colors. And the sun itself. Ah, there is no better sight. We are very fortunate to have such a country. Hikaru paid no more attention to the adult's conversation. He dimly heard the ringmaster reply, no doubt saying something to please his father. It was then he noticed something in the corner of his eye. Hikaru stopped, but neither his father nor the ringmaster noticed, and continued on. Kiki the monkey was sitting on a bucket filled to the brim with apples. Besides him was Cham, who was looking at the monkey, who had offered him one of the bright red fruits, with amusement in his amber eyes. The two were laying the shade of a propped-up tent. Nobody was around but the animals and Hikaru. Hikaru slowly edged forward to the two exotic and rare animals. Kiki had jumped off the bucket of apples and had instead run up the base of Cham's spin and nestled into his pale fur. He wrapped his small tail around himself. Cham didn't seem to mind about his friend sleeping on him, and instead slowly closed his ends and drifted off in a peaceful sleep, his pale tail swaying slightly as though it had a mind of its own. Hikaru slowly grabbed one of the plump apples. Cham stirred as he heard the sound of Hikaru's sandals hitting the dried dirt. His amber eyes seemed to glow in the shade as the tiger opened his eyes and focused them on the approaching prince. Hikaru offered Cham the apple he held in his hand, a small yet happy smile. Something rare for Prince Hikaru was on his pale features. Here, the boy said as his hands slowly edged forward. Cham's lips and facial features turned into a snarl as he saw the boy get too close for comfort, his amber eyes blazing. Hikaru gasped and quickly edged backwards as he heard Cham growl menacingly. Hikaru's spectacled eyes grew wide as Cham slowly got to his feet. He had never noticed how huge the saber-toothed tiger was from so close. Cham roared a challenge and a warning to the boy, who yelled and fell backwards on his rump, his eyes wide in fear. Cham suddenly leapt at him, but before Moon Country lost one of its airs, Hikaru felt someone grab him, and the odd sensation of being weightless as his surroundings suddenly changed. He realized then that somehow he had moved back several feet in a single second. You idiot! Hikaru flinched before slowly looking up to see the face of his savior. He could see the fury burning in En's blue eyes even from behind his red shades. En shook him slightly. What the hell did you think you were doing, huh? He's a tiger. He's wild. And you tried to feed him an apple? He could have bitten off one of your hands easily. You could have died. En shouted at him. By then Hikaru's father and the ringmaster had noticed they were missing someone in their party, and hearing Cham's roar, it didn't take long for them to figure out the problem. Young master, the ringmaster cried as he and Michiru burst into the clearing. By then En had placed the prince on the ground and stood over him with crossed arms. Don't worry, he's fine. I saved him before he could have gotten hurt, En told the relieved father and ringmaster. The ringmaster gave a huge sigh of relief that his employer's son hadn't been eaten by his tiger. Young master, Cham doesn't like people, he told the quivering and shaky boy. Even I have trouble sometimes with him. Michiru, having realized that his son was safe, grabbed the maroon-clad man by the scruff of his suit and angrily yelled, You have to do something about that thing. It's dangerous. My son could have died, the overweight heir yelled at Cham's owner as he shook him. Dee, don't worry, the ringmaster offered the upset man hastily. I'll lock him up in his cage and keep a close eye on him. What in Kami's name is going on over here? Yujito's voice rang through the tent's clearing as she appeared standing on one of the tent poles and looked down upon the males with raised brows, and raised a hand in greeting, the other holding the scruff of Hikaru's tunic. Hey Yujito-chan. Don't worry, nothing bad happened under my watch. Somehow I find that hard to believe, Enkuin, Yujito stated with a small grin as she jumped from the thin post and landed lightly on her sandaled feet. She and the others froze when they heard Cham growl and started to prowl forward towards the Nibi Jinchuuriki. Cham's amber eyes fixated on Yujito's sky blue. Oh, young lady! The ringmaster cried out as he saw Cham prowling towards the blonde girl. Besides him, Michiru gasped and looked away, fearing the wild beast would attack her. Cham suddenly stopped and sniffed the air. Something close to realization burned in his golden eyes, and suddenly Cham leapt at Yujito. Yujito, who didn't expect to be jumped on by a tiger, fell to the ground while the ringmaster, Hikaru, and Michiru gasped in horror. Only En remained emotionless, because he had known what the look in Cham's eyes had been. Yujito felt Cham's tongue lick her cheek, making the girl laugh as Cham's great and furry head nuzzled her lovingly. Eh? The ringmaster gasped for what appeared to be the 100th time today. Cham was being nice to her, he hadn't even tried to eat her. Michiru, who had been peeking through his fingers, gasped as well as did Hikaru. Ah, you're just a big fuzzball, aren't ya? Yujito laughed lightly as she hugged his head. Cham's eyes were closed contently, and his tail was waving happily as Yujito scratched a certain spot behind his ear. Cham didn't eat you, the ringmaster said in surprise. Cham never let people touch him. Not even him. Yet this stranger was accepted by the tiger with open arms, or paws he guessed, and chuckled as he watched the fearsome tiger purr like a content house cat. Cats really love Yujito-chan. He explained vaguely, seeing as he was the only one in the group that knew that inside her the two-tailed cat lied within her. He assumed that's why all cats loved her, even Shur, and, whose gaze was fixated on the laughing Yujito and the purring Cham, didn't notice Hikaru's emotions until he managed to rip himself out of En's loose grip and run away from the clearing. He could have at least said thanks En for saving me from being eaten by a tiger whose fangs are as long as my arm. You're the coolest, and your rap is even awesomer. And scowled as he watched the blue and white form of Hikaru disappear in the hectic scene of the circus. Oh, calm down, Enkun, Yujito said as she sat down cross-legged and Cham's head laid contently on her lap. Come pet Cham-kun, he's a real sweetheart once you get to know him. Actually miss, the ringmaster intervened nervously of the girl who had somehow managed to tame Cham without trying. We need to put Cham in his cage. Yujito scratched Cham's ears. You won't need to do that, I'll keep an eye on him. He won't cause you any trouble, right Cham-kun? Cham merely yawned in her lap, showing off his pearly white saber fangs that made Michiru back up nervously. Oh, okay, the ringmaster said, seeing as he had noticed the Kumogakure hiatate placed upon her forehead, and would rather not get into a fight with a certified killer. Well, as long as you make sure he doesn't run off or tries to eat anyone. Yujito nodded her head in agreement. Don't worry, I can handle him, she promised the ringmaster, who warily left the clearing with Michiru. Soon enough it was just En, Cham, and Yujito in the small grassy clearing. En shook his head and gave his best friend a warm smile. Only you can befriend a tiger with fangs the size of my arms in the matter of 2 seconds. Yujito gave him a similar smile. Well, it is me. Don't forget Nibby, and told her with a grin. She's probably the reason why all cats adore you. You're like catnip to them. En's grin widened and Yujito felt a shiver go down her spine. No, Yujito said rather bluntly as she looked at the son of the Sandaime Raikage with a deadpan. Don't even think about it. En looked at her innocently. Think what? Catnip-chan? He asked with a grin so wide Yujito wondered how his face didn't crack. Yujito huffed in annoyance. Whatever, En. With that said and done, Yujito got up and walked away to where she knew the others would be, Cham following her. En stood there in the abandoned clearing, his head reeling. What no, Kun? He thought with a small hint of worry. Was it something I said? Wait a minute, she called the tiger Cham-kun. Oh no. En's eyes widened in realization and his jaw dropped in shock. Was I just replaced by a tiger? His yell echoed all over the circus encampment. Once again the caravan with all of Michiru's splurging objects was moving at a slow pace. Thanks to Michiru's spending habits, the number of wagons and carts had doubled since they had left the circus, not to mention the large number of wagons holding the circus animals and equipment. The whole line seemed to be nearly a mile long, which made it much harder and annoying to guard. What's up with you, En? Karui asked her childhood friend with a raised brow, her amber eyes looking concerned at the look of devastation in En's baby blues. You look like you had just swallowed a whole lemon. En looked at his red-haired friend and mumbled something under his breath. Karui moved her head closer to the Jinchuuriki and cupped her ear with her hand. Say again? The brash Quinochi asked. I said I was replaced by a tiger, and said with sadness leaking into his tone. Karui blinked. What? I know, right. A tiger? And nodded impatiently. Yes, a tiger. Why would I mention a tiger if there wasn't a tiger? Because it's you, Karui saw with a deadpan, and scowled. That's besides the point. What should I do about it? The blonde asked his friend with raised brows, yet Karui could notice a hint of desperation hidden in his tone. What? Why are you asking me? Karui asked in surprise, and snorted, and crossed his arms while looking at the swordswoman with a leveled gaze. Duh. Yujito's a girl, you're a girl. You guys obviously some kind of code. He said as though it were obvious. Karui rolled her eyes. What does me being a girl have to do with any of this? Weren't we talking about the tiger? No, we were talking about Yujito. You mean how Yujito replaced you with a tiger? Well, that's a matter of perspective. Karui glared at the boy. You just said it yourself. And you're the one who came to me for advice because you were replaced by a tiger. She yelled at the boy who could be so dense at times, and warily back up as he saw Karui clench her hands into fist, a dead giveaway that she was thinking on whether or not to punch him. And since it was Karui, he was sure that she was more on the punch end until he's nothing but a single bruised side. Well, you're the only one I can ask. If I went to Omo, he'd start sprouting off that since Yujito replaced me with a tiger, the end of the world and all of we know is upon us. If I went to Darui-sensei, he'd tell my brothers and they would never let it go. So you're my last option. Well, hooray for me, Karui grumbled, and I either didn't notice Karui's lack of excitement to being his consultant, or he just ignored it. So what do you think I did wrong? He asked the Kunoichi. Was it because I snuck off one of her instant ramen cups when she was sleeping? He asked in concern. Karui's sweat dropped at that, while you really love ramen, don't you? It's the food of the gods, Karui. Honestly, how long have we been friends? If you never saw my addiction, I'm afraid we may have to rethink our friendship. Karui stopped walking, a look of realization burning in her gold eyes. She looked at the confused N with wide eyes, a small smirk forming on her lips as she suddenly started to shake in laughter. Oh! She drawled out, I get it now. She burst into laughter, drawing the attention of some of the wagon drivers. She wiped a stray tear from her eye. You're jealous. What? And yelped in fright, before he straightened his back and looked at Karui with his impression of Itachi, cool as a cucumber, and as cold as the ice littering the mountains of Lightning Country. I don't know what you're talking about, he stated. Yes you do, you're jealous. Karui crowed as she looked at her tan friend with a devious look on her face. Finally she could get him back for all the times he had used her as a practice dummy for his raps back when they were kids. Oh, life was sweet for Karui at the moment, and looked like he was about to argue before he turned sheepish, maybe? He offered with a weak smile while Karui beamed at him. Well, it's about time. Karui exclaimed, I was beginning to think you two wouldn't confess your feelings until you were as old as your dad. Karui leaned closer to N, their shoulders touching as she spoke into his ear. Here's what you got to do. Despite the slow approach to the ports, the large group of caravans and circus folk arrived in time. Sadly for them, none of the ocean liners from Moon Country could take them to Mikazuki Island due to the recent storms brewing. Michiru merely waved the report away, stating that he had already rented several temporary vessels to carry both himself and Hikaru, as well as all of the things the rich prince had splurged on across the ocean to the capital. If anything, Michiru seemed eager to hold off on their journey back to the capital. Instead, the man had entered a flower shop and had bought everything but the shop itself. Papa! Hikaru's muffled voice came from somewhere in the ornate cart that held over several dozens vases of exotic and beautiful flowers. Where are we going? The young boy asked curiously, having no memory of the dirt road they were traveling on. Michiru smiled warmly at his son, his black eyes shining at the thought of the end of their journey. He had foregone his normal bandana and had instead opted to comb his black hair down with a gold comb. To see your mother, Hikaru, he explained. Hikaru gasped, shocked that was the reason they had stopped from leaving to the capital. Hikaru had never met his mother, at least as far as he could remember. If he tried hard enough, he could sometimes remember warm eyes and a kind smile, but nothing else. Hikaru glanced out of the window, eager to meet his mother after so much time had passed, and Darui walked on either side of the white wagon, the others having stayed behind to make sure everything with the other people packing would go smoothly, and wondered who Hikaru's mother was. Seeing as they were on their way to see her, the young Chunin assumed that if her and Michiru had ever been married, they weren't anymore. He also wondered on how exactly Michiru was so in love with her. Seeing the puppy dog eyes that he got when he mentioned her, it made him wonder what she was like. Having never had a mother, and couldn't really speak from experience. After several minutes of walking, the cart with the two heirs slowly pulled to a stop in front of an old farmhouse with the paint peeling off of it thanks to age and the salty air. In front of the small and old house, a young woman in her mid-30s glanced up from where she had been picking vegetables from the garden, and noticed that she had the same amber eyes as Hikaru, not to mention her facial features were similar as well. That's his mother? En thought in surprise, but she looks like a nice lady who's actually nice. Hikaru's mother slowly stood up as she looked at the ornate carriage in front of her. She wore a simple light green sundress that had smudges of dirt etched into the faded fabric. Her raven black hair was straight with her bangs curling near her eyes ever so slightly. The only thing she had that seemed remotely luxurious or lavish was a simple turquoise necklace placed upon her neck. The carriage jiggled slightly as Michiru stepped out, his entire body hidden behind the dozens of lavish bouquets of flowers. The woman stepped closer, her hands holding a simple basket of tomatoes. She looked at the newcomers with curiousness, not recognizing them. Michiru leaned over slightly so you could make out his boyish and chubby features through the vibrant flowers. His eyes were alight with love as he looked at the simple woman who, despite wearing a drag dress and working in the dirt, looked like a princess in all her right. "Long time no see, Ameo-chan!" Michiru exclaimed happily, his lips stretched into a wide beam. Behind him Hikaru slowly emerged from the carriage. Ameo's eyes widened in recognition, a gasp erupting from her lips as she dropped the basket of tomatoes as her hand flew to her lips. The tomatoes hit the ground, but Ameo paid no heed as she rushed forward, the soft and tender fruit being squashed underneath her sandaled feet. Michiru's gleaming eyes seemed to widen even more, a huge grin gracing his face. "Oh my honey!" Michiru exclaimed as he lifted his arms to hug his wife, dropping the dozens of bouquets of flowers in the process. Ameo didn't even spare the overjoyed man a second glance. She instead rushed past him and slowly knelt down next to the silent Hikaru, who seemed to be at a loss for words. "Hikaru?" The woman spoke for the first time. Her voice was warm and kind, reminding Anne of honey. Hikaru merely stood there, as quiet as a mouse, his amber eyes never leaving the amber eyes of his mother. "You're Hikaru, right?" the honey-eyed woman asked desperately, a hint of joy lacing her warm tone. She suddenly engulfed the young heir in a tight and desperate hug. Tears streamed down her pale cheeks as she hugged her only child for the first time in what must have been years. "Hikaru! My little boy!" Ameo sobbed into her son's shoulder. "It's really you!" Hikaru stood there as he felt his mother's embrace for the first time. His pale cheeks were tinged red as he blushed slightly. When Ameo finally pulled away, Hikaru looked down on the ground shyly. "You've grown, Hikaru," Ameo said softly as she looked at her child with misty eyes. "All grown up." The sound of footsteps behind the woman became apparent as she saw vibrant roses in the corner of her eye. She finally turned around to look at a slightly hurt and deflated Michiru. "Who are you?" Ameo demanded, angered that this stranger was interrupting the few precious moments she had with her child. Michiru gasped in shock and hurt, obviously upset that his wife didn't recognize him. The few remaining bouquets of expensive flowers crashed to the ground as Michiru's arms slumped to his side. "You're so mean, Ameo-chan!" Michiru cried out, his cheeks puffing out and his eyes a little misty. "It's me!" Ameo looked at the man with narrowed eyes, desperately trying to remember who he was. Slowly dim recognition sparked to life in her golden eyes. "Don't tell me." "Michiru?" she asked in shock. "That's right." Michiru beamed at the woman, finally happy that his wife recognized him. Ameo's jaw dropped to the ground and her eyes widened comically. "No way. You're a whole different person. What's up with all the fat?" Michiru looked saddened and looked away from his wife for a moment. "It was because you left. I ate all the time to appease my sadness and I turned out like this." He patted his round belly for emphasis. Ameo's eyes went back to their normal width as she looked at her husband before glancing down to her son, who had yet to speak and instead was finding the rocky dirt very interesting. She glanced over to where Anne was leaning against the carriage with an unreadable expression, while Darui gave her a lazy wave. "Yo." The shaggy-haired man greeted. Ameo blinked before sighing deeply through her nose. "Why don't you all come inside? I'll make iced tea." Michiru smiled. "Oh, you always did make the best iced tea. Come along, Hikaru," he cheerfully said as he followed his wife into the small run-down cottage, their sons slowly following while North and Darui followed close behind the second in line. Once Ameo had given her guests their beverages, and secretly agreeing with Michiru that she did make the best iced tea, Michiru finally got to the conversation he had been wanting to say, and what Ameo had been dreading. "I want you to come back with us," Michiru begged his wife. Ameo slowly stirred her tea with an old spoon. What do you mean?" She feigned ignorance, but she knew exactly what her husband meant. "I miss you," Michiru said somberly as he drank his iced tea and looked at his wife with pleading eyes. "So does Hikaru." "I told you I don't want to be with you anymore, Michiru." Ameo snapped at the large man, her warm attitude having frosted slightly at his request. "If not for that damn prenup, I would have taken him with me, and away from you. Why do you hate me so much?" Michiru pleaded to his wife, honestly confused and saddened on why his wife seemed to hate him so much. Neither of them paid any attention to where Anne and Darui were silently leaning against the aged wall of the kitchen. "Is this how normal parents act like?" Anne wondered, having never had a mother. He couldn't exactly speak from experience. Seeing as his father was the Raikage and his brothers were, well, his brothers, they weren't exactly considered a normal family. Seeing as B, like him, had a bijou stuck in their guts and were considered by many to be eccentric, and the other brother had a very short temper that made him ignore doors and instead run through walls, while their dad was just a complete badass. I gave you everything you ever wanted, remember? Michiru reminded his wife. When Ameo didn't answer, the Prince of Moon Country looked at two familiar and aged heads peeking out of their bedroom door. Is there something else you want? Ameo stopped her pacing and looked out onto the grassy valley that ended upon steep cliffs, the roar of the ocean crashing against the rocks audible even from so far away. Yes, the most important thing in the world, Michiru, Ameo said with a frosty chill to her words, both En and Darui having experience with women, and when their tones lowered meant either two things. Run for the hills and live the rest of your lives as a hermit, ever fearing of her coming after you and dealing out your complete annihilation, or to just accept your fate and be destroyed. Sadly for Michiru, he was Michiru. His materialistic and somewhat spoilt mind slowly shifted its gears as he thought intently on what he had not given his wife. The items were few and sparse in between. Suddenly he snapped his fingers in realization. I got it! A palace, right? No! Ameo screamed at him with a clenched fist. The tan man stepped back in fear at the anger burning in his wife's eyes. After waiting for a couple of moments to allow Ameo to cool down and slowly lower her clenched fist, Michiru weakly added, a summer home? A villa, perhaps? Michiru went near the door of the kitchen where an elderly man and women were peeking in on their conversations. Well, what about your parents? They can surely live with us in the capital, or even in a remote villa on a different exotic island, or the mountains if you so wish. Besides him, the aged couple beamed at the thought of such a great opportunity of retirement, and nodded their heads at their daughter, who merely growled in annoyance that nobody seemed to understand what she truly wanted. And it wasn't a villa in the mountains, or a summer home on the beaches of Moon Country. Please, Ameo-chan. Michiru went down on his knees, his hands clasped together, beseeched with wide doe-like cold black eyes. Let us live together again, I beg you. Whatever you want, I can get it. Fine silks, beautiful dresses, exotic animals as pets, fine food and wine, jewels, anything you wish. The rather large prince took her hands in his, tenderly rubbing them with his thumbs, his eyes misty as he looked at the love of his life. I'd even give you all of Moon Country. At these words, Ameo lashed out at the prince, her slaps sending him sprawling to the ground, and made to move forward to stop what he knew would be a bad argument, but Darui's hand on his shoulder stopped him. He glanced at his teacher, who merely shook his head. Michiru looked up at the simple farm woman with tears streaming down his cheeks, his jaw trembling as his hand touched the red mark on his tan cheek. Ameo merely looked down upon her husband with cold fury. You haven't changed at all, Michiru, Ameo stated with a small hint of a tremble in her voice. Not one bit. She looked down on him with those sad eyes, not at him but at who he was. Even after all this time, you still don't know what is truly important in life, and you never will. The last part came out as a barely controlled sob as she stormed out of the kitchen and into her bedroom, the door slamming behind her. With a small, barely audible sigh, Darui stopped leaning against the wall and walked over to the still trembling Michiru. Lord Michiru, I think we've overstayed our welcome. It's pretty dull to stick around when we aren't welcome. I think you're right, Darui-san. Michiru wiped off his tears as he slowly got back on his feet. Please go retrieve Hikaru from the backyard, please. Michiru then walked out of the humble household with a heavy heart, and desperately trying to hold back his tears. Even after all this time, you still don't know what is truly important in life, and you never will. What am I missing, Ameo-chan? Michiru pleaded in his head as he stumbled his way into the ornate carriage and settled himself in the padded cushions, fully aware of the empty space beside him where he had thought his wife would sit when she accompanied him. What is it that you see? And what is it that I'm blind to? Michiru thought long and hard about this, barely noticing his son seating himself in the cushioned seats in front of him. Hikaru's amber eyes, Ameo-chan's eyes. Michiru thought heavily, looking anywhere but at his father. Michiru hoped he hadn't heard any of his parents' argument. Michiru looked out of the small window, watching the countryside pass by him. He thought of what he was missing in his grand and materialistic life. He thought long and hard. He couldn't think of anything, and you never will. Ameo's pained voice rang in the prince's head all the way back to the harbor. Chapter 33. Gathering of Storm Clouds. What's wrong, Yujito-chan? And asked as he slurped up his miso ramen noodles. Besides him, Yujito was eating her own non-perishable noodles without gusto, a slightly angry and depressed expression on her face. The two chunin of Kumogakure no Sato were sitting on a pier, awaiting the orders of Prince Michiru to get on board to sail to the capital of Moon Country. Yujito sighed as she looked at the sun setting on the waves of the ocean, its brilliant golden light spreading the land in its warmth. Her sandaled feet idly stirred the water beneath her. The stupid ringmaster had to put Cham in a cage, said it was better if he was in his cage during the voyage. Yujito unhappily slurped up some noodles, Can you believe that? En hummed in agreement to his best friend's words. Well, he is a tiger. Maybe the guy doesn't want Cham to scare any of the sailors? He's not that scary, honestly. En gave her a deadpan. Have you seen those fangs of his? Not to mention he sorta tries to attack anyone who comes near him if you aren't any of us. But I think that's just because Cham knows we're your friends. Yujito rolled her eyes, before she looked at him with amused eyes. And yet I see that the ringmaster hasn't asked you to put your little friend in his cage yet, eh? Small nimble fingers had slowly inched their way into En's ramen cup, before quickly retracting with the noodly goodness that was instant ramen, the soft slurps audible even with the waves crashing against the stonework of the harbor and the beach. En smiled as he patted Kiki the monkey on his head, mindful of his little hat. What can I say? Obviously I intimidate that ringmaster. Plus Kiki isn't as intimidating as Cham is, unless you're hiding fangs the size of my arm somewhere in ya, eh? He asked the monkey, who merely blinked with his wide green eyes, his mouth full of noodles. Yujito watched as the little monkey climbed up En's arm and up his back until his whole form was nearly hidden in En's golden locks. She had to beat back the microscopic dark and evil piece of her that was a fangirl from squealing kawaii, and suddenly turned thoughtful as he looked at the tides hitting the stone pier silently below their feet. He slowly turned his chopstick in his ramen as he pondered on his thoughts, and finally En spoke. Yujito-chan. Do you remember anything about your mother? He asked so softly that Yujito had to strain her ears to catch. When the words slowly computed in her mind, she looked at her best friend with wide eyes and a confused look. What brought this on? The blonde orphan asked her best friend and fellow Jinchuuriki with surprise. The topic of her parents had only come up once in their lifetime. And that was when they had died and Yujito had come to live with the Raikage's family. When she had first met En for the very first time. She had only been 3 at the time, as had En, and she could barely even remember the encounter. Something happened when we were at Michiru's wife's house, and it just made me realize something. En's hands were clenched to his sides. Yujito could see the faint glint of his blue eyes even underneath his crimson shades. I never knew my mother, he said softly. It never really mattered. I had my dad and my brothers, and they're the only family I needed. I love them, and they love me. Simple as that. But? Yujito asked her friend softly, understanding him more than he realized. But it makes me wonder what it would have been like to have a mom. How she'd read me stories at night and tuck me in, give me a kiss on the cheek and all that stuff they have in the movies and books, and said, I know about her from Kyuubi, but I've never looked at her memories. Yujito jerked her head in surprise. She had been there when Kyuubi had told En that his mother had been his previous container, and how he held some of her memories. She had always assumed that En had taken up the fox on his offer. If her mother had been Nibby's container, she would have taken it in a heartbeat. But to find out that En had never done it surprised her greatly. Why? She asked curiously. That's the best way to know your mother. Since she's, well, gone? Going through her memories is the next best thing. Why didn't you? Because the only memories Kyuubi can give me are the few times she had gone into the seal. Then Yujito understood immediately why. She had been there too when Kyuubi had told him how En's mother had treated him. She strung him up on a giant boulder wrapped in chains. Spikes were pierced through his tails and hands. She never realized the real Q. En said softly, a small tear trailing down his tanned and whiskered cheeks. Yujito slipped her hand in En's and gave him a reassuring squeeze. My mom was a Kunoichi. Of course she'd be dangerous, but to her enemies. And Kyuubi was an enemy, to her. She didn't do what we did, befriend our so-called burdens. In her defense, I think we're the first ones to do that so far, Yujito said softly. She knew how much Nibby hated her previous Jinchuuriki, and for the nice and pervy Bijou to hate someone, that person had to have done something to get on her bad side, and Yujito was sure he hadn't tried to befriend the Two-Tails. Yeah. But it still doesn't change the fact of what she did. I understand why. Sure, Q can be a bit of a dick, but he's a good friend. He's like another brother, granted a brother bigger than the Raikage Tower and the temper issues of my brother and father combined, but he's not that bad. Hell, he's probably the only normal one in our family. And mused with a slight grin, not knowing that Kyuubi was listening to his words with disbelief. The great Nine-Tails didn't say anything, but he was silently glad that he had taken up En's offer all those years ago. I don't want to see my mom's memories because I don't want to see the bad ones, and explained. I don't want that to be the one thing I know about my mother. I want to remember what Q told me. How she was so caring and protective of her friends and family, and how much she loved me. Yujito leaned her head against En's shoulder, her hand still in En's hand, and sighed as he leaned his head against hers. Together the two watched the sunset, each lost in their own thoughts, thinking of the mothers they would never know. Hikaru's mom left him and his dad a couple years ago, the kid barely even remembers her. And said after a couple minutes of silence, she left him because she couldn't stand Michiru and his materialistic ways. She was a simple-born woman, plain and simple. She kind of reminded me of Tsunami, and seeing as Michiru is, well, Michiru, she couldn't stand their different ways of life, so she left. Has he spoken since you guys got back? Yujito asked, her slitted eyes trained on the solitary form of Hikaru sitting on a wooden pier. He was playing on the game console, but even from so far away the Jinchuuriki could see the frown marring his pale features. Not a peep. And asserted, having now gone back to eating his ramen noodles with fervor. Kinda nice, really? Yujito rolled her eyes, and, don't be a jerk. Don't you remember Inari and how you guys always butted heads? Now he calls you big brother. Hell, you even gave him a pair of your sunglasses. Watch, sooner or later I think you two will get along. Pfft. And I'm more likely to swear off the color red and stop eating ramen. Yujito stood up, whatever en, I'm going to go check on the boat. Kiki, come with me. I'll put you in Cham's cage, you can be with En later, okay? She asked the monkey, who looked at her with wide green eyes before leaping from En's golden locks onto her arm, and gave her a wave of goodbye. I'll stay here. Make sure Hikaru doesn't die again. Plus I need to regain my manliness after you saw me tear up a little. Maybe I'll punch a dolphin in the face or something. And mused while Yujito chuckled at his antics before walking away, and watched as Yujito entered the large cruise liner that would take them to the capital, and finished off the rest of his ramen, his ears perking slightly as he heard footsteps against the aged wood. He glanced up to see Hikaru looking at him. Is that good? Hikaru gestured towards the ramen cup, speaking for what must have been the first time in hours, and broke his chopsticks with a resulting snap, before putting them in the empty cup. He looked at Hikaru but saw no ill feelings in his amber eyes, and raised a golden brow suspiciously. What's up with you being nice? You remind me of my friend Samly, who's cold as ice. Hikaru blinked unsurely, not at all used to En's raps, and rolled his eyes, not that Hikaru could see under his dark sunglasses. Yeah, it's good, En snorted, but not good enough for you, I bet. Hikaru looked away with a small scowl on his face. Obviously he wasn't used to being insulted. You don't like me, do you? Hikaru asked the Chunin, who had stood up, nearly towering over the young boy. Looks like Yujito was right. You do have a brain, and here I was wondering that thinking caused you pain, and said dryly as he made to leave to where he knew would be his and his teammates' quarters. Unknown to the blonde Jinchuuriki who was walking away from the boy, Hikaru suddenly came to a realization and had to speak his mind. With his lips turned into a smug smirk, Hikaru called out after the teenager, "Be my servant," and stopped walking immediately. His eyes wide behind his shades and his whole body tensed. And turned his head around in confusion. What? Hikaru took his chance and continued, "If you were my servant, I could give you anything you want," and rolled his eyes and walked away. "I don't need your charity, kid. I can get my own stuff without your help." He started to walk away back towards the boats. Hikaru followed him, much to the Kyuubi Jinchuuriki's annoyance. Toys, games? Anything you want. I'm a shinobi kid. We stopped playing with toys a long time ago. As for games, what kind of games would you even think I was interested in? I'm a shinobi. We don't play civilian games. We consider playtime being entailed to use explosion tags and smoke bombs. Kinda out of your league. I can give you anything. There has to be something you want. Geez, this guy is persistent, I have to give him that. But honestly, if he thinks toys are going to win me over, he's going to have to duck fast. He thought in his normal rhymes. Why don't you want to be my servant? Hikaru demanded, obviously at a loss on why, and kept refusing his offers. En's eye twitched, as did his fists. Must. Resist. Urge. To. Kill. Annoying. Brat. He thought desperately as he resisted the urge to punch the boy across the bay. He turned around so fast that Hikaru bumped into him, and leaned over him with a small growl, making the prince back up with wide eyes. Don't treat people like your personal playthings, he growled out, his hands clenched into fists. Hikaru winced, obviously expecting the boy to explode on him. Luckily for the Eren had enough temper control beat into him by Yujito to not punch him through the metal ship. With a scoff, En turned away and stalked away, not noticing Hikaru's dark look. Smack! And froze as he felt one of Hikaru's toy arrows stick to the back of his head. His face turned the color of Kyuubi's eyes as he slowly turned around. Hikaru lowered the bow and backed up nervously as En grabbed the arrow from the back of his head, snapped it in two easily, and then channeled a large amount of crimson light into his palms, turning the arrow into nothing but ash that scattered with the wind. Kid! and growled out, his face an ugly shade of vermilion. I would run if I were you, otherwise Moon Country is going to be short one prince. He roared into Hikaru's face. Hikaru leapt back before racing away from the angry Jinchuuriki and towards the ship. Huh, you didn't beat the kid into a bloody pulp. Looks like Yujito's lessons on self-control and temper has finally gotten through that thick skull of yours. Kyuubi spoke to the boy for the first time since they had fought Chifu. Hey Q, how long have you been up? Thought you were taking one of those old-timer naps. A snort echoed in En's head with the intensity and volume of a large explosion. Pfft. I don't take old-timer naps. I have nothing else to do in here. Least I'm not in that cramped cage anymore. The smell of that sewage water is going to take years to get rid of, and snickered internally. Who'd have thought that the great Kyuubi was worried over how he smelled? If you want, I can change my whole lifestyle so it smells like a grandmother's attic, if you so desire, O mighty Ninetails. If you do that, I will not hesitate to eat you. No, you won't, you love me. You're right, you'd probably taste awful. I still hate you though. So it looks like Yujito threats lessons on controlling your temper worked, almost said with a nervous look, having seen the heated glare from the Nibi Jinchuuriki and had quickly changed his vocabulary. Least he wanted to be sliced into cat kibble and fed to Shur. Oma and the others could think of no other hell worse than that, and didn't say anything. He merely continued to eat the large hunk of meat that had been brought before him. His mouth seemed to unhinge as he stuffed the large leg of some large and plump animal into his mouth, only the white tibia visible, and managed to make muffled sounds as he tried to talk. He swallowed heartily as he took out the clean bone. I really wanted to punch that kid, but I'm not dumb enough to hit a kid who may one day rule a nation. We already got enough stuff going on. Plus I'd rather not get thrown through a window by Dad. Karui took a large bite out of her own leg of meat, her facial features turning thoughtful. Doesn't that already happen now? The redhead asked the shaded Chunin, who grunted something while his friends and comrades snickered, knowing that Karui was right, and leaned backwards in his chair, his arms crossed as he scowled at his still snickering friends. He noticed out of the corner of his eye that Darui, his own sensei, had a wry grin as he silently chucked as well. You guys just don't get our manly love. We're Yatsuki. We don't compliment each other or what other families do. We punch each other through walls and have meat-eating contests. Yujito turned green as she remembered those contests. Ugh. How in the seven hells do you guys even do that? Where does it all go? Well, aside from B, his food just gets all over the room. He shrugged. Like I said, we're Yatsuki. We're the manliest men around, he said proudly, sitting tall and proud at his seat. The moment was ruined when Karui got annoyed by his smug, if not true, statement and flicked a pea at the Kyuubi Jinchuuriki, which hit dead center of his forehead. The others laughed while En leaned forward, his cheeks a bright red as he fumed at the young girl, who merely smirked and leaned backwards. Before the young Jinchuuriki could argue with the brash Kunoichi and also his childhood friend, their conversation was not meant to be. The reason being the arrival of Prince Michiru. The silverware clattered as the man's beefy hand hit against the table in an effort to stop himself from crashing onto the deck of the ocean liner. The man's face was a bright color of vermilion, the empty bottle being the reason why. Oh, sorry, the prince slurred out as he leaned backwards and nearly tripped as the boat rocked slightly. He gave the chunin and one jonin a small beam as he bobbed his head to the tune one of the circus folk were playing on their bongos. If I dance and be merry, then I won't have to think, no heavy thoughts at all, he explained to the chunin, as he started to dance to the tune. Either he had been born with 2 left feet, or the prince was so drunk it was affecting his motor skills. Michiru yelped as the liner rocked yet again, sending him careening to the side with an exaggerated display of flailing arms. En glanced over to see Hikaru sullenly looking at the table of assorted shinobi and kunoichi. Judging from the kid's face, he had been watching their heated yet warm exchange of good-natured barbs from the other side of the deck. Seeing as his father was drunk and was his only real companion, the boy sat alone. The blonde looked down as he felt soft fur brushing against his neck. Kiki's wide green eyes were staring up at him pleadingly. And chuckled, oh alright. He groaned good naturally as his hand went into one of the hidden pockets in his flak jacket before reappearing with a handful of dried fruit. You keep dried fruit in your flak jacket, En-kun? Yujito asked with a deadpan as she watched Kiki quickly gobble down the fruit before giving his friend a small furry thumb up, and raised a brow at her. And why wouldn't I? What else would I put in my pocket? Smoke bombs, kunai, shuriken, ninja wire. You know something that we actually need? The Jinchuuriki smirked. Well, when you 3 are stuck in a cave with a giant boulder trapping the entrance, you won't have any food. Karui munched on her breadstick. I'd just break the boulder. Since we'd have explosive tags in our pockets, or I could just punch it until it's rubble," she said offhandedly. En sighed wearily and ran his hand through his shaggy golden locks. "Why can't I even win an argument or conversation with you? You keep twisting my words until I'm all black and blue." The assorted Chunin groaned at his words. Omoe and Karui looked especially annoyed, as after they had finally become Chunin they had hoped to take a break from En's older brother, and their sensei that seemed to have a rather large influence on En, seeing as he opted to rap just like Kurabi. They wished they had taken the escort mission with Ko and Samui to the Land of Frost. At least then they would have been several countries or so away from the two self-proclaimed artists, and wouldn't have to listen to them for a couple of weeks. The Yatsuki blinked as he looked up at the sky, just noticing the approaching darkness of night. They had arrived at the impromptu party before the sun had begun to set. Night had slowly set in while they had traded light-hearted barbs and feasted on food that wasn't packaged in a cup or dried rations, muttering an excuse, and got up while the others decided to stay for a bit longer, catching up on matters they hadn't discussed yet. With a content smile, and walked towards the door that led to the lower decks of the liner, which was where he and his comrades spent their nights. He paused suddenly as he heard the low rumble of thunder in the distance, and glanced up at the sky and noticed the crescent moon shining above him, the stars dancing and twinkling in their ethereal light. Dark storm clouds were beginning to form on the horizon, the smallest flashes of lighting appearing far away round the ship. The Chunin then heard a rustling in his mind, the sound of a large animal shifting ever so slightly before he heard the rumbling and booming voice of one of his closest companions. "Storm clouds are gathering," the great Kyuubi growled out as he looked through En's eyes. "A storm is coming," and agreed with his tenant who had been with him since even before his birth, his lifelong companion. "But it make you wonder, is it just this physical storm? Or an ill omen that speaks of dark times ahead of us? I do not know, young one," Kyuubi said truthfully as both Human and Bijou watched the approaching storm clouds, and knew that the direction the winds were flying and the direction they were sailing, they were going to collide. The animals should be tethered, or I hope at least the crew got around to that. And thought before he entered the metal hallway and followed the way to his room that he shared with Omoe. The thoughts of storms still fresh on his mind. "En! Oma!" A hand roughly shook En's shoulder that woke the boy abruptly from his dream. His eyes snapped open and he blearily looked at the person who had waked him up. Yujito stood before him dressed in a purple jacket and ninja pants. Her wide eyes looked worried. "Yujito?" Omo mumbled out as he shifted in his cot to look at his childhood friend with bleary brown eyes. "What are you doing here?" His eyes narrowed ever so slightly, whether in suspicion or exhausted no one knew. "What if you really aren't Yujito and instead you're an imposter who's trying to kidnap En and the heirs to Moon Country? I could have stopped you had I not been lazy and—" "Shut up, Omo!" Omo was suddenly hit on the head by his sandal that had been thrown at him by none other than Carrie, who was also dressed in her day clothes. Though her blood-red hair was frizzy from the sea and climate, and looked like she had just rolled out of bed was the only sign that it was late in the night. "Yujito, Carrie, what's going on?" And asked blearily as he sat up from his cot, and rubbed his eyes to get rid of the sleep that clung to his eyes. "Are you deaf?" Karui asked sarcastically before gesturing around the room, and then noticed that the boat was rocking back and forth violently. He could hear the clap of thunder that boomed so loud it jarred his teeth, and though he could not see it he knew that lightning was flashing through the dark sky. And realized immediately, they had hit the storm. And now the storm was hitting them back with the wrath and rage of a very angry Bijou. "The animals!" Omu cried out as he realized with dawning horror that the circus animals that Michiru had bought were still on the top deck in their cages that were only tethered to the boat by thick ropes. But even rope that thick could easily break as the cages shifted on the rocking boat. And quickly got out of bed and grabbed his jacket, Omoe doing the same. Fully aware that he was just wearing boxers, he grabbed a pair of sweatpants that were crumpled on the floor and quickly put them on, not noticing that Yujito and even Carrie were blushing profusely, and flipped the back of his hood onto his head. "Let's go," and said as the ninja rushed out of the room, knowing that each second was precious in saving the animals. As they ran down the hallway, not even violently rocking boat could deter them or slow them down. Carrie, ever the bluntest of them, couldn't help but say, "So do all your boxers have pictures of grinning fox heads?" She sent him a look that and just knew she was judging him. "Really?" she asked with a complete deadpan. "Shut up, Karui," and muttered under his breath darkly. "I'm sorry, I didn't know that my choice in boxers were going to be scrutinized tonight. Oof," and stopped as he realized he had barreled into someone, sending the person crashing to the ground, though N hadn't realized it until the person had made a noise. And what was the most surprising thing was the person who was skulking around the ship during the stormy night. "Hikaru?" Sure enough, the second in line for the throne of Moon Country was currently sitting on his bum and rubbing the spot on his head that had bumped against the thin carpet. Hikaru stopped his administrations to his sore body part when he realized that it was En who had run into him, and saw that Omoi, Karui, and Yujito had stopped further down the hallway and waiting for him to join them, and gave them a quick wave that signaled for them to continue on, before he looked down at Hikaru and crouched down to look the amber-eyed boy square in the eye. Hikaru realized that this was the first time he had seen En without his sunglasses, seeing as the young Chunin had left them on his nightstand, and was completely surprised to see En's sky-blue eyes staring at him with a questionable look. "Cat got your tongue?" En asked bluntly as he crossed his arms. Hikaru glanced down shyly. The last time they had talked flashed through his head, and sighed when he realized he wasn't getting anywhere and was wasting time. "What are you doing here, Hikaru? Shouldn't you be with your father safe in your room?" Hikaru bit his lip before that old spark reignited in Hikaru's eyes, and he then rebuked rather childishly, though seeing as Hikaru was a child, and couldn't blame him. "What are you doing here? We're going to help save the animals. Their cages and tethers won't do them any good in this type of weather. If we don't hurry, then they'll be thrown overboard and drown," he explained with a surprising amount of patience. Yujito would be proud that he at least refrained from hitting the source that highly annoyed him, but since Hikaru was a kid, that sort of helped the heir apparent. Hikaru scoffed at that and looked down at the worn carpet as he leaned against the wall of the hallway. "Just leave them alone," he muttered softly under his breath, but En easily heard him even with the waves crashing against the boat and the roaring thunder. En blinked. "Say that again?" he asked quietly, but there was anger evident in his tone. Hikaru scoffed again, making En wonder if he shared any lineage with the Uchiha. "I'm already sick of those animals," the young boy said rather darkly before looking away from the young Chunin from Kumogakure. "Just let them be." Crash! Hikaru jerked in surprise and fear as En's fist crashed through the wall with ease, barely an inch away from his face. Plaster rained down on the boy and scattered in his wild hair as Hikaru raised his hands to his face to deflect any wayward splinters. After a couple seconds of tense silence, Hikaru glanced up. En's bloodshot crimson eyes burned down into the golden eyes of the prince, who immediately gasped in fear and tried to scurry backwards, but the wall prevented him from getting farther away from the Jinchuuriki, who had finally lost his temper. "Why you?" En said darkly, his hands clenched into tight and shaking fists. "How can you even say that? Do you even care about anything besides yourself?" En spat at the spoiled prince, who quivered under the gaze of the Kyuubi container. When Hikaru didn't speak, and spoke again in such a soft voice it felt as sharp as a sharpened sword. "You're trash, you know that? No, you're worse than trash." Hikaru didn't say anything. Even when En stared at him angrily, he couldn't find the willpower or courage to speak. But En didn't care and continued on his angry rant that he had wanted to say since the boy had first tried to shoot him with a toy arrow. "You don't care about anyone but yourself. You're spoiled to the core. You have no sense of honor or manners and treat my friends and I like we're beneath you. Here's a newsflash, kid," and poked the boy rather sharply in the chest with his finger. "Omo, Karui, Yujito, Darui-sensei are better people than you. This crew is better than you. The circus workers are better than you. Because none of them are spoiled brats who don't give a rat's ass about others. Go, run back to your room where you're safe and out of the way while people actually try to do something noble and not be cowards." And then turned on his heel and ran down the hallway where his comrades and closest friend had run down, leaving the quivering Hikaru leaning against the wall with a slumped head. The heir's entire body quivered as he laid there on the ground, his hands balled into tiny fists. "I am not trash," Hikaru slowly declared as he looked up. His amber eyes seemed to glow in determination and anger. With that said and done, Hikaru stood up and raced down the hallway where En and the others had through as fast as his slipper-clad feet could take him. "Karui!" En yelled to his fellow Chunin as he held one of the ropes that were tethered to the neck of the large mammoth. "Help a friend out over here." Karui handed Oma a handful of prairie dogs that she had taken out of the cage and raced over to where her friend was pulling the rope towards the lower deck that the crew members were trying to lead the panicked animals down. The mammoth reared backwards as lightning flashed the storm-torn sky and as thunder boomed Karui, and En had to jump backwards to avoid being smashed by the beast's giant front feet. "Come on, buddy," En coaxed the giant mammal gently as they pulled the giant being towards the giant door. Luckily their combined strength allowed them to pull the beast out of its cage and towards safety, and while the giant furred elephant fought and struggled, he soon gave up and allowed the ninja to pull him towards the lower deck where the other circus animals were being led down. "And Karui!" Yujito yelled over the roar of the storm, she had started to channel a small amount of chakra to the soles of her feet as the deck was starting to flood from the seawater that crashed into the ship with mighty waves and the boat rocked back and forth violently. The others had also done this so none of them had to worry about being swept off the boat by a stray sea wave. "Have any of you guys seen Cham?" the nibby Jinchuuriki asked loudly as she ran towards them. Both Chunin shook their heads in a negative. Yujito cursed as she glanced around, but the rain was pouring so fast and thick it was near impossible to see, with the animals being moved around and the men and women working as fast as possible did little to help. "Look out!" The cry of one of the circus workers broke through the roaring sounds of the vengeful ocean, and glanced up as lightning struck the sky in a blaze of powerful light. He saw that the large towering stacks of metal boxes start to sway precariously in the powerful gale of wind, and blinked as he saw the very top start to tumble, causing a deadly domino effect. Quick as the yellow flash, and Shu shined in a burst of red lighting and grabbed a hold of a crew member who had been about to be crushed by several tons of souvenirs. The shinobi quickly Shu shined back to safety, setting down the shell-shocked civilian down on the flooding deck before racing back into the fray. Chaos. Pure utter chaos reigned through the boat, animals fighting against their ropes and chains, their eyes wide with fear as men and women raced to save them from the fury of the storm. Lightning flashed and illuminated the boat as clear as day, and would have long slipped off the flooded deck without the use of chakra. "Young master!" The terrified yell of the ringmaster was barely audible over the roaring waves of the ocean and the screaming of the harsh winds. And glanced upwards, having to squint through the layer of seawater and rain, only to see a flash of teal against the darkness. Hikaru, dumb brave Hikaru, was attempting to unlock the large cage that belonged to Cham, the Siberian tiger that had tried to kill him mere days ago. The boy slipped as the boat rocked violently, but managed to keep a good grip on the iron bars of the cage. Cham didn't attempt to attack, he merely stood there with wide, fearful eyes as the storm threatened to sink the massive ship. Hikaru finally managed to twist the large bronze key, and quickly opened up the cage. Cham leapt out of the metal box, Kiki climbing up his wet flank in relief to see his companion, and saw as a faint triumphant smile graced the prince's lips, his amber eyes wide with pride as he saw Cham free from his cage. Not a moment later, a large wave crashed against the hull, enveloping Cham's cage in its greedy grip before sweeping away while the cage began to sink to the bottom of the ocean. Had Hikaru not freed the tiger, then Cham would have met an unsavory end at the bottom of the sea. "Maybe the kid isn't that bad," Kyuubi muttered in En's head, the young Jinchuuriki slowly agreeing with him. Before the Kyuubi Jinchuuriki could so much as blink, lighting flashed overhead, illuminating a wave as high as the ship. The wave slammed against the cruise liner with the fury of a divine being, and started forward as the water rushed at Hikaru. A moment later he was gone, swept away by the wave. "No, Hikaru!" And rushed forward, ignoring the waves of seawater slamming against him. He leaned over the side of the ship to see Hikaru dangling from a wayward net, his foot slowly loosening and threatening to drop him to a watery grave. The moment Hikaru started to plummet, En's hand clasped around the boy's ankle. "Don't you dare fall," and yelled over the roars of the storm. "Oh, okay," Hikaru stuttered out, his eyes glued on the form of the Cloud Chunin who, as though he was a sack of potatoes, managed to lift him back to the safety of the deck. "Are you okay?" and questioned as he squatted down by the downed child, who suddenly felt very, very tired. Hikaru murmured out, his eyelids felt heavy. The young prince saw something big and furry run towards them, and suddenly the smell of salt water was briefly overcome with the pungent smell of wet fur. Hikaru watched as En's mouth opened and closed, obviously yelling something over the roars of the storm, but even that has slowly lessened as darkness reached around the corners of his eyesight. Hikaru closed his eyes. Days soon passed after the storm had hit the ship. Hikaru had awoken the next morning healthy and fine, despite the life-threatening situation he had thrown himself into at the expense of saving Cham's life. It seemed Cham had realized this as well, for the next time Hikaru had set foot on the deck, Cham didn't snarl nor growl at the prince. The proud black-spotted tiger had merely prowled up to the nervous royal, and nuzzled his large head against the boy's chest, purring like a house cat, and realized that maybe he was wrong about Hikaru. Sure, the kid could be a spoiled brat at times, but his actions proved that he was redeemable. Saving Cham's life, even putting his own in danger, just proved that, and had sheepishly apologized for yelling at him, claiming that his temper did sometimes get the best of him. Yujito had bonked him on the head when he said that, claiming that he let his temper get to him all the time. She conceded when she realized that he was just being an brash, lovable and who would rather run through a wall than use a door or window. Hikaru had started to cry then, not caring what those aboard the ship thought of them. He had apologized to En for being a jerk, for treating him and his friends like trash, and for acting like trash himself. En had merely grinned, finding the meeting reminiscent of Inari back at Wave, and had brushed the apology away and instead held his hand out for a fist bump, which Hikaru shyly provided. All that knew that once you were given a fist bump by either him or his brothers, you had become someone worthy in their eyes, that you had become a loved one and a comrade. Yujito had smiled at that, knowing that she had been right in her thoughts that sooner or later En and Hikaru would become friends. It had been the same with Inari. The two had clashed and nearly brawled, but in the end when the team had left, the goodbye had been like saying farewell to a brother. That was something she loved about En. Sure, he could be a brash fool who couldn't rhyme words to save his life, but he was a loyal friend and comrade and people flocked to him. He was like the sun, so bright and cheery. You know, you really should ask him out, Nibby said idly from inside her seal, her amber eyes fixed on her sharp claws as she studied them. I think I will. There was a sigh from within her head. Kitten, you need to get a move on sooner or later or else Nibby stopped talking when the words were comprehended. Nanny, you were right all along, Yujito thought to her tenant, a smile gracing her pale facial features. I love him. What finally made you admit it? Nibby was surprisingly calm as she spoke, though inside the seal her amber eyes gleamed in pride. I don't know, Yujito admitted as she gazed out on the horizon, her mind a million miles away in memory. It's always been there, but I just didn't realize it. I'm happy for you, Nibby said sincerely, any hints of teasing or perverseness having left the great bijou and instead Hansaldi congratulated her host on, finally, admitting her feelings to a certain blonde Kyuubi Jinchuuriki. But then again, this was Nibby. So, does this mean I can finally give you the sex talk? Nibi, and had to admit that Moon Country was nice. While he had never been to the country before, he couldn't help but notice how different it was from Kumo and the various villages and towns located around Lightning Country. Lightning Country was well known for her harsh terrain, deadly winters, and common thunderstorms. With most of the land made up of mountain ranges and valleys, the place was freezing for anyone stupid enough to not bundle up. The land was harsh and the people harsher, you had to be in order to survive. His father had once told him when he was a child that harsh people ruled the world. It would make sense, as they would be ready for anything. The capital reminded him of a much larger Tanzaku, though the buildings were a lighter color. It was also completely abandoned. Shops were closed, shutters were drawn hiding the inside of the buildings. No children played outside, nor did any tourists or natives walk the roads. And didn't see so much as a cat lounging in the alleys. It was as though the entire world had suddenly disappeared once they stepped inside this rich capital, and could hear music playing from concealed speakers, a bunch of drums and various instruments, and didn't know of made a peppy ambient that made En think of beaches and bonfires. How weird, Michiru mused to himself from the inside of the carriage, his dark brown eyes flitting from one empty building to an empty kiosk that were found everywhere in any tourist town. This is supposed to be a real busy street. Michiru himself had often come down here from the palace, usually to buy exotic and expensive wares to fill up the void Ameo had left in his heart. And Yujito, Karui Omo. Darui murmured under his breath, his lone visible eye subtly looking at a supposedly abandoned alley. But the Jonin sensei had seen someone dart through, wearing armor and wielding a sword. The four Chunin subtly nodded their heads, their eyes flitting around the empty town for traces of any unsavory individuals who would like nothing more to kidnap two princes for a tidy profit. Despite their well-founded fears, the party managed to exit the once thriving town and arrived at the palace without so much as a peep of trouble. Even the birds stayed quiet as they moved through the forest, as though the entire world had suddenly gone silent. When they arrived at the gilded gates of Moon Country's grand palace, they opened without question. The palace was quite large for such a small, though wealthy, country. The roof was a royal blue that matched with the evening sky, the walls a brilliant white. Gold gilded much of the windows, and on the highest tower sat a balcony for the royal family, their sigil etched in the purest of gold. Michiru and Hikaru expected to see guards awaiting them, along with a plethora of servants and maids, but not even the gardeners were out. I don't like this, Karui muttered under her breath as she glanced around the empty courtyard, her hand held on the hilt of her sword. This just screams trap. Omoin nodded his head at her words, nervously looking around for the slightest amount of life, whether friend or foe. From the shadows of the front doors, two figures emerged. The one leading the other was garbed in royal purple robes with silk scarves. Behind him was a, "Whoa, is that a guy or girl?" and asked under his breath to Yujito, who looked just as confused as he did. "Forget about him, or her," Karui muttered back, having heard En's question. What in Kami's name is up with his facial hair? Indeed, the dressed noble had the largest mustache the Chunin had ever seen. The dark brown facial hair nearly covered the man's cheeks and joined up with his mutton chops, making him look like he was about to get strangled by the hair. Shabadaba. Prince Michiru called out in greeting, obviously pleased to finally be greeted by a familiar face, even if his choices in facial hairstyle was a bit odd. Prince Michiru. The man greeted, his hand pressed against his heart, while the person of unknown gender watched the scene play out with folded hands. Good traveling through the different countries, I presume? It's wonderful that you have returned safely. Thank you, Shabadaba. Michiru yelled up to the older, paler man. The wide beam slowly turned into a confused frown. Ano, the town looks a bit odd, almost like the townspeople have up and vanished. Did something happen? Shabadaba looked down upon the royals and the assorted Chunin and single Jonin with cold black eyes, his facial features twisted in a cruel, pitying smirk. The king is dead. Immediately Michiru's face erupted in shock, his warm brown eyes wide and started to pool tears of grief. A strangled gasp came from him, and Nanny. He looked ready to collapse there on the dusty ground. As soon as the now first in line to the throne spoke, the sounds of metal creaking and the sounds of padded boots marching became apparent, as dozens upon dozens of guards swarmed the previously abandoned courtyard. Upon their shoulders was the sigil of the royal guard, a curved golden crescent against a field of royal blue. They surrounded the group, hands held ready on their spears, swords, and other assortment of weaponry. Shabadaba watched the scene with cruel amusement. The man-woman gave a scoff-like laugh as she watched the shocked form of Michiru being surrounded by weapons. I shall inherit the throne! The now-known traitor exclaimed from his spot. The guards readied themselves for battle. Of course! Karui sighed out as she grabbed the hilt of her sword and got into her stance. Omo readied his sword as well, his mouth empty of any sugary sweets. Yujito held her tanto, while Enja stood beside Michiru and the carriage that held the now terrified Hikaru. You, as heirs, are in my way! Shabadaba exclaimed, kill them! He ordered the large assortment of guards who, as one, rushed to their former rulers with readied steel. The sight of several short swords flew high in the air. The guards rushing towards and stumbled slightly as they saw him in his iconic seven swords dance. Bring it! And yelled at the dozens of guards through the sword in his mouth. A man with a spear charged forward, a war cry on his lips as he eagerly tried to run the younger warrior through with his spear. And spun in his spot, the sharpened blade slicing through the wooden shaft easily, leaving the guard holding the end of a very useless wooden stick. Several guards rushed forward, for a couple of moments, and were hidden behind the taller and older soldiers. An onlooker may have thought that the boy had been swarmed by the guards. Drill! The guards cried out in pain as En continued to rapidly spin in place, his entire form blurring as he spun in a circle, and was just a mere blur of red and yellow. Cuts, both thin and deep, appeared on the guards as they were flung away from the spinning Jinchuuriki. They lay prone on the ground, groaning in pain, and suddenly appeared up high in the air. The remaining guards flung themselves out of the way as swords started to fall through the sky like deadly rain. Only a few of the hardened veterans managed to dodge the blades, while the rookies or the idiots suddenly found a sword thrown in their guts, and suddenly shoo-shined away, dodging a spear that had been thrown at him by another guard that managed to stay standing. Said guard suddenly crumpled to the ground as Yujito appeared behind him, a quick chop to the neck severing the man's consciousness. Yujito used her tanto to disarm or dismember her attackers. Using her foot she kicked one of En's specially made swords and watched as it quickly arced in the air, and suddenly appeared and grabbed it, before falling back to earth and landing square on a man's chest, making the guard collapse within a crater. The young Jinchuuriki quickly dodged the spear thrusts and the sword jabs. He rolled back and forth underneath their feet, jumping up in the air by pushing up on his hands whenever someone swung low. In the confusion of the guards trying to kill En, the young Yatsuki had grabbed each of his swords from bodies or the ground and was once again using his unique kenjutsu to utterly decimate the civilian guards. Out of the corner of his shaded eyes, and noticed his sensei easily defeating the guards that had turned their attention, and their weaponry, upon the heirs to the throne. Darui easily defended them, but the guards continued to come out in swarms. It's no good, he heard Omo yelled out amongst the sounds of fighting. We can't use any destructive jutsu in this situation. We could hit one another or Michiru and Hikaru. The fighting suddenly paused when the sound of hooves became apparent, along with the sound of something made of metal. A quick glance to the ornate gates was all it took to find the source. A giant metal carriage pulled by several horses had appeared on the road and was currently coming towards the attempting coup d'etat. A man in the same armor as the guards attacking the royal family, and their guards jumped out of the carriage, a war cry coming from him as he charged forward. and readied himself to kill the man, who was currently heading towards the carriage where Michiru and Hikaru were hiding in. But to the surprise of the defenders, the man attacked his fellow guards instead, disarming one of them. The guards immediately stopped fighting when they saw the man, who did not wear a helmet like the others and thus one could see his face. For a couple of tense seconds there was only silence, before the mutters of the traitors became audible. Captain Kurega? The captain was a built tan man with a spiky shock of brown hair. His dark eyes were light in fury as he looked upon his former subordinates. On his chest was a red sigil that the Chunin assumed was what marked him as the captain of the guard. "He's a traitor!" Shabadaba yelled out to his supporters, his hands tightly wrapped around the marble banister. "Kill him!" One of the guards followed Shabadaba's command and quickly raised his sword against Kurega, who easily raised his own and blocked it. "What are you fools doing?" he demanded. "Snap out of it!" He easily disarmed the soldier and knocked him out with the butt of his sword. Another guard came forward and traded blows. "He's not the true ruler," Kurega grunted out as he fought his former comrades. Another guard suddenly appeared, his sword aiming for the man's unarmed back. Darui appeared out of nowhere, and with his monstrous sword easily dispatched him. "Yo!" Darui greeted their newfound ally. "Who are you?" Kurega demanded as he dodged another sword slash. "Jonin Sensei Darui from the village hidden in the clouds." Darui tapped a finger against the hiatate on his shoulder. "We were sent by the former king to protect Lord Michiru. Can you give me cover to protect His Majesty?" Kurega asked, looking well reassured that shinobi from the cloud were here to stop this madness. There was a red blur as En suddenly appeared, his body coated in crimson lighting. Men screamed as En easily defeated them from well-aimed punches and the coursing electricity. "Sensei," En called out. The Jinchuuriki didn't look too injured despite the swarms of guards. "We should get out of here. We can't protect them here." He nodded his head to the carriage. Kurega quickly climbed aboard, the driver having been killed in the skirmish, and quickly flicked the reins. The horses immediately started to pull the ornate carriage away from the traitors and to the safety of the forest, the other metal carriage quickly following. "Team!" Darui yelled out to his comrades, "We're leaving!" Karui, Omoi, Yujito, and En quickly nodded their heads and with the use of their chakra easily escaped the area, leaving Darui alone. Man, why can't things ever be dull? Darui wondered aloud as the guards all focused upon him and rushed forward, hundreds of swords or spears trained on him. With a couple of hand seals, Darui finished his jutsu right before the first man got as close as 10 yards to him. Storm release, laser circus. A halo of bright white light glowed around Darui's hands, lighting the color of white crackled to life. As the guards rushed forward, Darui activated his famed jutsu. Bolts of lighting shot out of the halo, hitting the first wave of guards square in the chest. The lighting soon moved on to another conduit, their swords and armor. The guards fell, electrocuted within their own armor. The courtyard hadn't been spared either. The once finely kept yard now looked like a battle zone, pools of blood everywhere from the swords of Kumogakure shinobi and Kunoichi. Hundreds of dead or unconscious guards littered the ground where craters had formed thanks to En and his super strength. So dull, Darui sighed wearily as he looked upon the destruction. Glancing up at the pale faces of Shabadaba, he was tempted to just shoo Shin up there and kill him, effectively stopping this coup d'état once and for all. But Darui sensed several large chakra signatures high above in the alcoves of the castle. Shinobi were here, and Darui had a bet that they weren't friendly. The lone Jonin then disappeared in a shock of black lightning, quickly teleporting back to his comrades. High above the castle, 2 men and 1 woman knelt on the roof where they had watched the battle happen with interest. "Humph, this certainly changes things." One of the men, a man with a head of fiery orange hair that spiked like that of Jiraiya of the Sannin. The man didn't seem overly concerned, if the growing smirk had any say in the matter. The woman, who had the build and height of a child, smirked as well. "Should we go after them?" she asked slyly, her pink eyes gleaming at the thought of fresh blood to be spilt. The orange-haired man chuckled. "No, not yet." His blue eyes were as cold as chipped ice. "We'll go after them later." And the man's right hand, which was covered in a gauntlet and had a closed eye on it, but as he spoke the eye slowly opened and gleamed a deadly orange. The tile he was currently touching started to turn a dark gray before crumbling. "Get rid of them,"